They called them temptresses, monsters, witches in crowns, 27 queens and empresses smeared, slandered, and sanctified not for what they did, but for daring to do it as women. This isn't a tale of scandal. It's a study in fear, the fear of female power, wrapped in silk and silence. Behind every accusation of perversion lies a story that was too dangerous to tell, until now. Tonight, we descend into the dark halls of history where crowns glint like daggers and queens are punished for being more than ornamental. Welcome to 27 Queens branded as Perverted. Before we step further into the shadows, quick question for you. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Berlin? 3 a.m. in Manila? Because these are the kinds of stories that hit harder when the world's asleep. If you're into dark history, twisted power plays, and queens who refuse to stay quiet, hit subscribe. This is just the beginning. Valeria Messalina, Empress of Rome. She was Rome's most dangerous kind of woman, one with a crown, an appetite, and free time. Valeria Messalina, third wife of Emperor Claudius, had it all: imperial wealth, endless influence, and a husband who was too busy reforming Rome's sewer system to notice the empire rotting inside his own palace. She was young, famously beautiful, and disturbingly bored. And in ancient Rome, boredom in an empress was a civic threat. The senators called her insatiable. The poets called her divine punishment. The whispering servants called her something worse. She's remembered as the empress who allegedly entered brothels in disguise, not to raid them, but to work in them, willingly, regularly. According to one famously bitter Roman historian, she would sneak out at night under the cover of a wig and a fake name and compete with professional prostitutes to see who could last the longest. She won. Of course, that's if you believe Juvenal, or Suetonius, or Tacitus. Men who had very personal grievances against powerful women and no problem inventing monsters to validate their own powerlessness. But what makes Messalina's legend so hard to untangle is how convincing the mythology became, not because it was true, but because it was useful. Every time Rome needed a scapegoat, a cautionary tale, or a sex-drenched political cartoon, there she was, a wild-eyed woman in silk, wrapped in the fantasy of male fear. They say she used her imperial authority like a velvet crowbar, that if you were young, beautiful, and unfortunately not her husband, you might find yourself escorted to her private garden for an audience. And if you declined, if you dared, you'd wake up the next day and find yourself missing your title, your fortune, or your head. Depends on the mood. But it's hard to say where Messalina's real sins end and Rome's fever dreams begin. Because what do you do with a woman in the 1st century who refuses to act like a statue? A woman who laughs at the idea of sexual decorum and uses the same weapons men have used for centuries: beauty, charisma, manipulation, but without apologizing? You slander her. You mythologize her. You turn her into the Roman equivalent of a horror story, the Empress who couldn't be satisfied. Even her death reads like a fable. After allegedly conspiring to marry another man while Claudius was away, a move that may or may not have been a coup, Messalina was executed without trial. Her final moments weren't described with honor, or even basic dignity. One account claims she was given the opportunity to kill herself but couldn't manage the strength, so a soldier finished the job. Another said she simply wept and waited, alone in a garden, as footsteps approached. That, of course, made it into the dramas. The public, for their part, accepted the official narrative without much resistance. It was cleaner that way. Rome could move on, and the men could keep pretending that it was lust, not politics, that killed her. But in the centuries that followed, Her image metastasized into something more potent than any military conquest. She became the symbol of imperial excess, of feminine corruption, of desire weaponized into destruction. And yet, the question remains, was Messalina a debauched tyrant, or just a woman written into history by her enemies? The Roman elite had no shortage of scandals, men who burned down cities, poisoned relatives, or declared themselves gods. But Messalina, her greatest crime, it seems, was outdoing the men at their own game and doing it with silk in her hair. By the time her story travelled through the medieval monasteries and enlightenment salons, she had been transformed into a cautionary ghost, not just immoral, but supernatural in her depravity. The kind of woman whispered about in Latin textbooks and French drawing rooms alike. The kind of story that always begins with, "You won't believe what she did." But Messalina wasn't the only queen whose bedchamber became her battlefield. Centuries later, far from the marble columns of Rome, another ruler would take her lovers to the grave literally. Her enemies said her bedroom had trapdoors. Her lovers never left alive. She was a queen too, and her name was Joanna II of Naples. Joanna II ruled Naples with a crown in one hand and a dagger under the pillow. She was a queen of contradiction, devout in ritual, deadly in rumour, pious by day, and, as they said, perilous by night. Born in 1371, she rose to power in a kingdom already weighed down by betrayal, war, and the persistent stench of courtly decay. But Joanna wasn't interested in tidying up Naples. She was more interested in who she could seduce, silence, or disappear. The chronicles were not kind to her. They rarely are to women who rule without apology. Joanna was accused of luring handsome young men into her royal chambers, showering them with affection and favour, and then disposing of them like spoiled fruit. The most popular legend, of course, says that beneath the lavish floors of her bedroom lay a trapdoor, triggered only when the queen grew tired of her lover's face. Down he'd go into oblivion, or the dungeon, or the sea, depending on who was telling the story. It's easy to scoff. Trapdoors, really? But that's the thing about legends. They're rarely true in detail, only in spirit. And the spirit of Joanna's reign was one of relentless instability, laced with both erotic intrigue and brutal politics. For every noble who entered her court with stars in his eyes, another left in a coffin, or worse, in disgrace. Her favour could elevate a commoner to the head of the army. Her disdain could reduce a prince to ashes. It wasn't lust, really. It was power, dressed in perfume. One of the more infamous episodes involves her favourite lover turned courtier, a man named Sergiani Caracciolo. A nobody, elevated to noble heights by virtue of his charm and presence in Joanna's bed, or so the rumours insisted. For years, he effectively ran Naples through her name, amassing power that disgusted the nobility. When he pushed too far, plotting behind Joanna's back, she had him murdered. Not in the dark, not with plausible deniability, but publicly. His mutilated corpse was displayed for all to see. The message was clear. This was her kingdom, and no man would rule it through whispers and bedsheets. Naturally, this only deepened the rumours about her appetite, not for men, but for control. The trapdoor story? It's likely metaphorical. What better way to describe a queen who lifted her lovers up with one hand and pushed them off cliffs with the other? Joanna's political life was no less chaotic than her personal one. She married multiple times, though marriage seemed more like a political inconvenience than a romantic aspiration. Her first husband died early, poisoned, they say. Her second, James II of La Marche, tried to seize power from her and was swiftly expelled from Naples. She had no children, but plenty of suitors, most of whom came with armies, agendas, and fragile egos. She flirted with alliances the way others flirted at banquets, shamelessly and with a deadly smile. At one point, she even adopted Alfonso of Aragon as her heir, only to later revoke the adoption and name another instead. He responded, predictably, by invading Naples. For Joanna, power was not inherited, it was auditioned for, and men, regardless of their crown or sword, were expected to audition like everyone else. The court of Joanna II became infamous not just for its instability, but for its theatricality. Spies, poisoners, and secret lovers all thrived under her watch. Whether she orchestrated this atmosphere or merely tolerated it is unclear. What is clear is that Joanna's rule was not an accident. She held on to the throne for over 3 decades through uprisings, invasions, betrayals, and constant attempts to replace her. Not bad for a woman branded a nymphomaniac by her enemies. And why was she branded that way? Because she refused to settle, because she preferred her own counsel over that of her husband's, because men who tried to use her body to claim power often ended up dead or humiliated. The stories of her perversions may be more reflection than fact, a mirror held up to male anxieties, cracked just enough to distort the truth into something scandalous. But in the end, she died peacefully in bed, not by trapdoor, not by blade. No final lover to betray her. Just a queen who outlived her enemies and, inconveniently for the storytellers, died on her own terms. Still, the idea of her persists. A queen with a hidden lever under the mattress and a bored expression as another handsome man fell into the abyss. A fantasy? Almost certainly. But as we'll see, Joanna wasn't the last royal woman accused of such macabre indulgences. In fact, the next one took the rumors a step further. According to her critics, she didn't just dispose of lovers, she drank their blood. 2 queens in, and already the line between myth and smear campaign is starting to blur, and we're just getting warmed up. By the way, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it on your end? Because whether it's a late-night spiral or a mid-commute escape, these stories always seem to find the right moment. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. There's a whole empire of forgotten truths still ahead. Barbara of Cilli, Holy Roman Empress. History did not bury Barbara of Cilli. It embalmed her in scandal. Wife of Sigismund, Holy Roman Emperor, she was crowned Empress in an age when female ambition was expected to come veiled in obedience, and hers didn't. Born in 1392, Barbara was intelligent, multilingual, politically astute, and possessed an unusual tolerance for the slow-moving rot of imperial hypocrisy. She was also, by all accounts, breathtakingly beautiful, which, in medieval Europe, meant she was automatically suspect. And she didn't help herself by being competent. It didn't take long for the rumours to start. The whispers in court salons, the snide Latin footnotes scribbled in the margins of chroniclers' journals. Barbara was not just politically shrewd, she was, they said, depraved. A German Messalina, they called her, directly invoking the ancient Roman empress, whose name had become shorthand for scandal cloaked in silk. That comparison was not chosen by accident. When male rulers executed rivals or indulged in lavish banquets, it was empire. When Barbara did anything at all, it was perversion. The accusations came in layers. Some claimed she hosted occult gatherings in her court, blending astrology with something darker. Others said she drank blood, not metaphorically, but literally from the veins of her lovers, like some proto-Gothic horror story passed off as gossip. Whether these rumours were seeded by religious reformers, jealous nobles, or excommunicated poets trying to get back into favour is hard to say, but once they took root, they flowered with grotesque elegance. What made Barbara particularly dangerous to her contemporaries wasn't what she did behind closed doors, it was what she did in public. She owned property in her own name. She managed her own finances, negotiated her own alliances, and acted with an autonomy that deeply unsettled the Holy Roman status quo. She founded educational institutions, attended council meetings, and wasn't afraid to wield soft power with a sharp edge. In short, she behaved like a monarch. Naturally, she had to be punished, not legally, but narratively. A man with her skill set would have been celebrated. A woman with it became a warning. Her enemies accused her of manipulating her husband Sigismund, of using sex to control policy, and of organizing orgiastic rituals that culminated in the deaths of the participants. Never mind the complete lack of evidence. These weren't facts. They were fables, dressed up as footnotes. And the fables stuck. When Sigismund died in 1437, Barbara's fortunes changed quickly. The imperial court, no longer under her influence, cast her out. She was exiled from court life, stripped of her privileges, and subjected to a slow-motion character assassination that spanned generations. It wasn't enough that she'd lost her title, she had to lose her legacy too. Posthumously, Barbara was transformed into a cautionary figure. Catholic chroniclers painted her as a proto-witch, while Protestant ones weren't much kinder. Even Renaissance historians, supposedly more enlightened, portrayed her as a femme fatale, wrapped in necromantic mystique. She became folklore with a surname, not a person, but a trope. But in reality, Barbara was no more wicked than any of the kings or emperors who surrounded her. In fact, she was probably less so. She didn't lead armies into senseless wars or burn cities to the ground. Her real offense was showing the political world that power could wear a woman's face not as a figurehead, not as a consort, but as the one calling the shots. And that, to medieval Europe, was deeply indecent. The irony, of course, is that Barbara was branded perverse not because of what she did, but because of what she represented. The collapse of the comforting illusion that men alone are capable of ambition, ruthlessness, and strategy. She was a mirror held up to the imperial patriarchy, and they didn't like what they saw. She died in 1451, not on a pyre or by poison, but quietly, outlived by her slander, entombed in layers of distortion. Her real story, one of intelligence, autonomy, and complex survival, remained obscured by Gothic fiction. To this day, she is remembered less as a ruler and more as a vampire in a velvet gown. And yet, just as her memory was being rewritten into horror, across the world, in the flickering candlelit corridors of a distant Chinese dynasty, another woman was rewriting the imperial rulebook in her own way. Her name would be buried beneath centuries of shame, her legacy erased, reshaped, and blamed for everything the empire feared in female power. They called her a temptress. They called her unnatural. She was Empress Dowager who, and according to her critics, she didn't just break the rules of courtly behavior. She rewrote them with scandal as her signature. Empress Dowager Hu, Northern Qi, China. In the chronicles of China's Northern Qi dynasty, history doesn't walk, it limps through shadows. Among its most enigmatic figures stands Empress Dowager Hu, a woman whose name became synonymous not with triumph or governance, but with moral decay. Or at least, that's how the court historians chose to frame her. She reigned not as a figurehead, but as a power behind the screen, literal and figurative orchestrating palace politics through sheer will, charm, and the quiet brutality of strategic timing. Born into an era of fractured kingdoms and opportunistic loyalties, Lady Hu did what many imperial women had to do to survive. She adapted, fast, and without apology. The story begins in the middle of the 6th century, a time when the northern Qi dynasty was as unstable as the ground beneath a crumbling palace. Officially, Hu was the consort of Emperor Wenxuan, but it was only after his death that her legend, or rather, her infamy, began to bloom. Their son, Gao Yin, was too young to rule, so Hu assumed the role of Empress Dowager. In name, she was a guardian. In practice, she became something far more complicated: regent, manipulator, mother, and, depending on who was writing, seductress. The court said she crossed boundaries that should have remained sacred, not simply political boundaries, but ceremonial, moral, and deeply gendered ones. According to hostile chroniclers, she took eunuchs and officials as lovers not discreetly, but brazenly. This alone was enough to raise eyebrows. The imperial court was not known for its tolerance of independent-minded women, and even less so when those women blurred the lines between propriety and power. Was it true? Maybe. But then again, every female ruler who refused to disappear into the wallpaper of history was accused of something similar. When male regents ruled through personal networks, they were called pragmatic. When Empress Dowager Hu did the same, allegedly rewarding loyalty with personal access, she was branded depraved. The tales surrounding her became more lurid with each retelling. She favored one eunuch in particular, the story goes, elevating him from palace obscurity to a seat of unprecedented influence. And because this eunuch had, by definition, no traditional masculine threat to her authority, the rumors quickly swirled. She wasn't just empowering him, she was using him, manipulating him through some twisted mixture of affection and ambition. Whether this was political partnership, companionship, or a concoction of resentful imaginations remains unclear. But as always, nuance was the first casualty of imperial gossip. As regent, she made enemies fast. Hu was accused of interfering in military affairs, of dispensing patronage with favoritism, of meddling in court appointments, and of consolidating too much control too quickly. In a world dominated by warlords and ministers who saw female power as an aberration, a temporary, fragile anomaly, her assertiveness became dangerous. Then came the ultimate blow. Her son was deposed. Emperor Wenxuan's younger brother, Gao Yan, with support from ambitious ministers, usurped the throne. He saw Empress Dowager Hu not as a maternal figure but as a threat to be neutralized. Her son was forced into retirement, and Hu's political career should have ended there. Should have. But Empress Dowager Hu didn't disappear. In fact, she was allowed to remain at court technically stripped of power, but very much still present. That, perhaps, was her most unsettling trait, her refusal to vanish. Over the following years, she stayed entangled in court life, always close to the center, always uncomfortably present for the men who thought they had outmaneuvered her. She lived long enough to see the dynasty unravel assassinations, coups, and royal scandals tumbling down like a badly built pagoda. And through it all, she remained that inconvenient memory, the woman who once ruled without a man's shadow cast over her. So why was she called perverse? It wasn't because she governed badly. Northern Qi was doomed regardless. It wasn't even because she allegedly took eunuchs as confidants or lovers. It was because she disrupted the clean line of male succession and did it with elegance, control, and unnerving effectiveness. To the Confucian historians writing decades later, this alone was monstrous. A woman ruling, not quietly from behind a screen, but openly and shrewdly, that could only be explained through moral collapse. Hence the stories, the rumors, the soft poison of centuries-old defamation. And yet, behind the accusations lies a colder, more enduring truth. Empress Dowager Hu was never meant to survive the pages of history. She forced her way in. And in doing so, she joined a long, disrespected lineage of royal women whose power was so threatening they had to be turned into myths of corruption just to be forgotten properly. Of course, if the court considered her morally grotesque, they would have found her imperial descendant in Russia downright apocalyptic. They called her everything from a tyrant to a beast in pearls, but the favourite insult, whispered with delight across the salons of Europe, was that she loved horses more than men. Enter Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great. Russia. Catherine the Great never rode a horse in the way the gossips claimed she did. But try telling that to 18th century Europe, a continent so rattled by a competent woman in power that they felt compelled to invent an entire zoo of slander just to make sense of her. Born a minor German princess, Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst arrived in Russia with a borrowed title and a marriage to the heir of the throne. Grand Duke Peter, a man more fascinated by toy soldiers than actual governance, and who may or may not have dressed up rodents in military uniforms. Sophie, unlike her husband, came prepared. She read widely, mastered Russian, and converted to Orthodoxy. She also waited. Quietly, patiently, and with a strategic brilliance that would make Machiavelli blush. In 1762, she became Catherine II not by inheritance, but by orchestration. Her husband, now Tsar Peter III, lasted a total of 6 months before being deposed in a coup that Catherine may or may not have helped engineer. The details remain conveniently murky. What's certain is that Peter was soon out of power and shortly after, out of the picture entirely. Catherine was left standing, alone, with the crown. The moment she took the throne, the propaganda machine kicked into gear. It began with her politics. She was too educated, too French, too fond of Enlightenment philosophers for the Russian elite to fully trust. She corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot. She attempted legal reform. She even dabbled in the dangerous art of questioning autocracy, rhetorically, of course. This was not a woman content with court dances and embroidery. She was trying to reshape an empire. Naturally, this unnerved everyone. But politics alone wasn't scandalous enough, so the rumours turned personal. They accused her of excessive affairs, claiming she burned through lovers like state budgets. Her relationships with younger men, many of whom were elevated to positions of power, became the foundation of her infamy. The stories blurred the line between favoritism and fantasy, insinuating that no man near her was safe from seduction or promotion. And yet, when male monarchs took mistresses by the dozen, it was seen as tradition. When Catherine did it, it became moral treason. And then came the most absurd tale of all, that infamous story involving a horse. No need to repeat it. You already know it. Everyone knows it. It's the ultimate punchline in the long, dark joke that is misogyny disguised as folklore. The origin of the rumour? No one can say. There is no contemporary source, no credible eyewitness, not even a disgraced noble willing to take credit. It simply appeared, as slander often does, anonymously, viciously, and perfectly timed to reduce her to a caricature. Because how do you delegitimize a woman who outperforms the men around her? You don't challenge her intellect or her diplomacy. You attack her body. You turn her sexuality into spectacle. You animalize her literally. The real Catherine, though, was less interested in spectacle than in survival. She expanded the Russian Empire, modernized its administration, and patronized the arts and sciences. Under her rule, Russia became a force to be reckoned with territorially, intellectually, and militarily. But none of that made her immune to the chronic need of patriarchal history to reshape women into monsters. By the time of her death in 1796, Catherine had ruled for 34 years longer than any female leader in Russian history. She had survived palace intrigue, foreign wars, and a never-ending onslaught of character assassination. But the horse rumour outlived her. It always does. because it doesn't matter how many libraries she built, or how many laws she reformed, or how many territories she added to the map. To some, she would always be the woman with a scandal stitched into her legacy. And yet, the very absurdity of her legend makes one thing clear. No one spreads lies that outrageous about someone who wasn't deeply threatening. She scared the world into inventing nonsense. That's a strange kind of victory, but a victory nonetheless. Still, Catherine's story is almost polite compared to what came next. Because while her enemies reduced her to myth through mockery, the next queen on our list was painted in even darker strokes, accused of loving not just too much, but too wrongly. A woman whose name became shorthand for incest, indulgence, and excess in the court of France. And unlike Catherine, she didn't need any horses to horrify her critics. She only needed a crown and the wrong blood in her bed. Her name was Isabeau. Isabeau of Bavaria, Queen of France. She arrived in France at the age of 15, draped in silk and suspicion. Isabeau of Bavaria, the teenage bride of Charles VI, was not French, not fluent, and most importantly, not predictable. In a royal court already teetering on the edge of madness, her mere presence was seen as both a disruption and a forecast, and as it turned out, the forecast was grim. Charles, her husband, soon began to unravel. Not figuratively, literally. His mental breakdowns became legendary. Episodes of confusion, violence, amnesia. There were times he couldn't recognize his own wife, or his children, or his name. Once, he reportedly ran screaming through the forest, convinced he was made of glass. The King of France had shattered, and into that vacuum stepped Isabeau, a young queen expected to smile, breed heirs, and disappear quietly into the velvet background of court life. She did not. With Charles incapacitated for long stretches, Isabeau took up the work he could no longer perform. She negotiated with nobles, she coordinated finances, she held court. She even served, at times, as regent. And, predictably as always, competence in a queen became the seedbed for accusation. It didn't take long for the rumours to start. The court gossips muttered about her love of luxury. The pamphleteers turned her into a cartoon of greed. They called her a German snake, a spendthrift foreigner, a throne-seducing parasite, but most damning of all, they called her impure. The most infamous accusation was that she had committed incest, not with any supporting evidence, of course. Just vague whispers that she had taken her son, the future Charles VII, as her lover during her husband's absence. The claim was grotesque. Deliberately so, because that was the point. In medieval France, political delegitimization was an art form, and Isabeau's enemies wielded scandal like a dagger. Her close political alliance with her brother-in-law, Louis of Orleans, was reinterpreted as something unspeakable. Her diplomatic trips were seen not as strategy, but seduction. Her children, 12 in total, many of whom did not survive infancy, were used as evidence of her appetites. Never mind that kings who fathered dozens of illegitimate children were celebrated for their virility. Isabeau had simply had too many royal pregnancies to remain respectable. One of the more persistent slanders was that she had corrupted the royal court with her extravagance. It was true that she loved fashion. She imported silks from Italy, diamonds from Flanders, furs from the Baltic. But she also used these materials to project stability, to assure a fractured court that the monarchy was still intact, still glittering, even as the walls cracked behind the throne. Her wardrobe was less vanity and more political theatre. But nuance, as always, is the first thing to die in a scandal. And then there was the matter of the Treaty of Troy, a document that effectively disinherited her son in favour of the English King Henry V. Signed during one of Charles VI's darker spells, the treaty enraged the French and cemented Isabeau's image as a traitor. But the truth is more complicated. She was likely acting under unbearable pressure, caught between warring factions, trying to preserve the illusion of monarchy in a kingdom collapsing from the inside out. But no one cared. The narrative was set. She was the foreign queen who sold out France and betrayed her children. That was enough. Over the years, Isabeau's reputation hardened into caricature. Artists painted her with sly eyes and hidden daggers. Historians, many writing long after her death, turned her into a pantomime of maternal betrayal and erotic intrigue. She was no longer a woman. She was a warning. But buried beneath the accusations is a stranger, sadder story, one of a girl thrust into chaos, forced to rule a nation crumbling from both madness and war. A woman who tried to maintain a shred of control as her husband lost his mind, her allies turned against her, and her name became synonymous with moral collapse. Was she guilty of anything more than survival? Perhaps ambition, perhaps vanity, but certainly not the monstrousness she was accused of. And yet, her myth persists. Because nothing terrifies power structures like a woman who navigates the wreckage and still manages to walk upright. Isabeau was hardly the last queen to be framed as both seductress and traitor. A few centuries earlier, in the sun-bleached palaces of Egypt, another ruler had been cast in much the same light, seductive, brilliant, and, by Roman standards, completely unacceptable. She ruled not just with her body or her beauty, but with her mind, and her enemies. They turned that mind into something filthy. They called her Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra VII was never meant to be ordinary, and yet she has become almost too extraordinary to recognize. Over the centuries, her image has been inflated, twisted, sexualized, demonized, romanticized, and finally flattened into a kind of cultural shorthand. The seductive queen, the decadent temptress, the woman who brought down an empire with eyeliner and a smile. But Cleopatra wasn't a fantasy. She was the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, a woman born into a world of incestuous dynasties, political chaos, and Roman ambition. And unlike most of her ancestors, she actually spoke Egyptian. In fact, she spoke at least 9 languages, read philosophy, studied medicine, and engaged in statecraft with unnerving fluency. But somehow, despite all that, what most people remember about her is bees. Specifically, the legend that she invented a device allegedly made of hollowed-out gourd and buzzing insects designed for unconventional personal pleasure. The tale first appears not in any ancient biography or royal chronicle, but in the salacious whispers of writers centuries later. And yet it stuck, grafting itself onto Cleopatra's legacy with the stubbornness of myth. Why? Because a woman who commands armies, runs a navy, and challenges the Roman Republic? That's hard to understand. But a woman with a bee-powered contraption? That's a punchline. The real Cleopatra, of course, was far more complicated than the rumors imply. She inherited the throne at the age of 18, alongside her younger brother, whom she was forced to marry due to dynastic tradition. What followed was a vicious civil war between siblings, alliances formed out of necessity, and power plays that would make even the most hardened Roman senator sweat. Enter Julius Caesar. Much has been made of their relationship, that she seduced him, dazzled him, wrapped herself in a rug, and unfurled like a scene from a stage play. And perhaps some of it happened that way. But Caesar wasn't an idiot. And Cleopatra wasn't just a pretty face. Their alliance was politically expedient. Egypt was rich, strategically crucial, and on the brink of collapse. Aligning with Caesar wasn't seduction. It was strategy bold, brilliant, and necessary. Still, Roman propaganda did what it always does. It reframed her as the foreign enchantress who corrupted their greatest general. Not as a capable monarch defending her kingdom, but as a siren dragging men to ruin. The fact that she bore Caesar a son only deepened the resentment. That son, Caesarion, was a living challenge to Roman authority, a reminder that the East could still infiltrate the bloodlines of the West. After Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra made another gamble, Mark Antony. Again, the Roman version of the story paints her as the puppet master, the alluring queen who lured Antony away from his duty and into decadence. But the evidence suggests something more practical. Two rulers joining forces in a rapidly fracturing world. They needed each other, not just personally, but politically. They shared a vision for a Mediterranean power balance that Rome found unacceptable. What followed was war not just between nations, but between narratives. On one side stood Octavian, later Augustus, Caesar's heir and future emperor. On the other stood Antony and Cleopatra, increasingly framed as symbols of excess, Eastern corruption, and moral decline. Octavian's propaganda was relentless. He published Antony's supposed will, emphasizing his promises to Cleopatra and their children. He painted the Egyptian queen as a manipulator, a witch, an enemy of Roman virtue. And it worked. When Antony and Cleopatra were defeated at the Battle of Actium, the official story had already been written. Cleopatra didn't lose a war, she ended a world. Rome was ready to become an empire, and she was the final obstacle, painted as everything an imperial woman should never be: intelligent, independent, foreign, and sexually autonomous. Her death, though shrouded in legend, was used to seal her legacy as a cautionary tale. But the facts tell a different story. Cleopatra ruled for over 2 decades, during which she stabilized a fragile kingdom, navigated impossible political terrain, and faced down the might of Rome with more grace and intelligence than most of her male counterparts. So why the B device? Because it's easier to believe that a queen fell from grace because of lust than to admit she nearly outmaneuvered the greatest military power in the world. The rumors reduce her from a strategist to a spectacle, from a monarch to a metaphor. It's not just character assassination, it's historical sabotage. But Cleopatra wasn't the last empress to be dismantled by her own story. On the other side of the world, another woman rose to supreme power in a land that forbade her very existence on the throne. They called her a murderer, a manipulator, a usurper who clawed her way to the top by seducing monks and disposing of them like pawns. She was the first and only female emperor of China, and her name was Wu Zetian. 7 rulers down, and if you're starting to notice a pattern: women punished for power, pathologized for presence, you're not imagining it. Quick pause here. Where are you watching from? And what time is it? Are you in bed? Lights off? Phone glowing? Or halfway through your 3rd coffee, pretending this isn't the most riveting history class you've ever had? Either way, make sure you're subscribed. The deeper we go, the darker it gets. Wu Zetian, Empress of China. She was not supposed to rule. Not just because she was a woman, that much was obvious, but because she rewrote what rule even meant. Wu Zetian, the only woman in over 3,000 years of Chinese imperial history to officially claim the title of emperor, didn't inherit the throne. She carved it out of stone, redrew the laws, and inscribed her name where none had ever dared. And so, naturally, her enemies wrote her as a nightmare. Wu's early years were unremarkable in the way most dangerous beginnings are. Born in 624 CE into a relatively privileged but politically minor family during the Tang dynasty, she entered the court of Emperor Taizong as a concubine at around age 14. She was beautiful, yes, But more importantly, she listened, and she remembered. When Taizong died, palace custom dictated that his concubines, those without children, were to be sent to a Buddhist convent for the rest of their lives, a polite form of political exile. Wu, however, had other plans. She re-emerged not only at court, but in the bed of Taizong's son and successor, Emperor Gaozong. The scandal was immediate. A former concubine of the father now entangled with the son? It was the sort of dynastic contradiction Confucian scribes choked on. But Wu Zetian's rise was not built on scandal. It was built on something far more terrifying to the court: competence. She became empress in 655, but even that title was not enough. When Gaozong's health declined, she effectively ruled in his stead, issuing edicts, reshaping policies, and purging rivals with the efficiency of a seasoned bureaucrat. After his death, she ruled through her sons as Empress, Dowager, and Regent. But why hide behind men when she could reign alone? So she did. In 690, she declared herself emperor of a new dynasty, the Zhou, and sat on the dragon throne as the supreme sovereign of China. This act was not just unprecedented, it was unthinkable. And because history abhors a powerful woman without a tragic flaw, the propaganda followed like shadows behind a torch. Wu was accused of killing her own children to ascend, of poisoning rivals, of seducing monks, of elevating lovers to political office, then discarding them like worn-out scrolls. One tale even claimed she kept a harem of muscular young men, used and rotated as if they were ceremonial dishes. But what's most telling about these accusations is their convenience. Each one mirrors the same tired narrative that a woman in power must be morally defective, sexually unrestrained, and emotionally dangerous. It's not a new story, it's just louder when the crown fits too well. And Wu Zetian wore it terrifyingly well. Under her rule, the imperial examination system was expanded, creating a more meritocratic path into government, a move that threatened the aristocratic elite who relied on lineage, not skill. She reduced corruption, raised agricultural productivity, and supported the printing of Buddhist texts. She even introduced reforms that protected the rights of women, including decrees that improved their status in marriage and law. These were not the actions of a deranged seductress. These were the moves of a ruler who understood that power wasn't just taken, it had to be systematized, institutionalized, made permanent. But no matter what she achieved, her critics refused to let go of the narrative. The official court histories largely written after her death and under male successors eager to erase her influence painted Wu as a cautionary tale, the usurper queen, the mother who killed, the ruler who reigned through lust and manipulation. Even modern portrayals struggle to separate the real Wu Zetian from the myth. She is often depicted as a hybrid of genius and monster, brilliant but corrupted by ambition. Rarely is she allowed to be what she likely was, a leader who was both political and pragmatic, flawed but not fundamentally more ruthless than any emperor before or after her. What made her different was not her cruelty, it was her gender, and for that, she was transformed into legend, not the kind sung in praise, but the kind whispered in fear. She died in 705, quietly dethroned in her final years, her dynasty dissolved by the very men she had outmaneuvered. But her name remained carved into the black marble of history, untitled and yet unmistakable. Even her tomb was left partially unfinished, its steely blank, a haunting symbol of a legacy too controversial to record properly, too enduring to erase. And yet, for all the efforts to distort or silence her, Wu's legend continues to echo, because every empire that denies women a throne eventually creates the myth of one who dared to sit on it. The next woman didn't have to climb her way to the throne, she danced her way there. Born into shadows and spotlights, she turned scandal into currency, performance into policy. And when she finally wore the crown, the world refused to forget where she came from. Her name was Theodora. Theodora, Byzantine Empress. If history were fair, Theodora would be remembered as a savior of Constantinople, a woman who, in one moment of fearless clarity, stood her ground while men packed their bags to flee. A woman who spoke with more fire than the riots outside the palace gates. But history, as usual, had other plans. It remembered her not as an empress, but as a scandal. She was born in the late 5th century to a bear trainer and an actress. Not exactly the sort of lineage that screams future Byzantine royalty. In fact, it screamed quite the opposite. In Constantinople, acting especially for women wasn't just seen as lowly, it was synonymous with vice. The stage and the brothel were considered cousins, if not twins. So when Theodora eventually ascended to the throne beside Emperor Justinian I, the elite didn't whisper, they howled. Theodora's early life was lived on the margins. She performed in comedic theatre, often in roles that mocked power, gender, and morality, and by association, herself. She travelled with acting troupes through North Africa, lived hand to mouth, and absorbed every bit of wisdom that survival could teach her. She was intelligent, sharp-tongued, politically astute, and most threatening of all, unashamed of her past. She returned to Constantinople not defeated, but transformed. By the time she met Justinian, she had left the stage behind and was working as a wool spinner, humble on the surface, but not without strategic undertones. It was a position that suggested modesty, industry, and redemption. Justinian, already a powerful and ambitious official, saw in her what others refused to: brilliance. The two married, but even that required bending the rules. The law forbade high-ranking officials from marrying actresses, but Justinian, soon to be emperor, had the law changed. Their union was controversial, but unbreakable. When he rose to the throne in 527, Theodora rose with him not as a decorative empress, but as co-ruler. He called her his partner in all things. And she was. So the propaganda machine kicked into overdrive. Historians like Procopius, a contemporary of the imperial court, offered two versions of Theodora. In public works, she was praised as dignified and pious. But in his secret history, a venomous piece of behind-the-curtain libel, she was described in lurid detail, accused of immoral performances and unspeakable appetites. He painted her not as a ruler, but as a former performer who had simply taken her talents to the throne. He accused her of participating in indecent acts on stage, using her body as a ladder to power, and controlling Justinian not through counsel, but through corruption. One of the more repeated slanders claimed she entertained entire rooms of men, reduced only to her past, never allowed to escape it. In Procopius's telling, her policies were just extensions of her passion's calculated performances masquerading as reform. But the reforms were real. Under Theodora, women's rights improved dramatically. She strengthened anti-exploitation laws, expanded protections for women in the legal system, and built safe houses for those who had no other refuge. She advocated for the rights of actresses and others in her former position not as charity, but as justice. And then came the moment that should have defined her legacy. The Nika riots of 532. Furious over political grievances and factional violence, mobs descended on Constantinople. Half the city burned. Senators encouraged Justinian to flee. His advisors urged retreat, and he nearly agreed until Theodora stood up. In one of the most iconic speeches never delivered by a general, She reportedly said, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud." She would rather die an empress than live in exile. That speech, its resolve, its quiet horror, its refusal to cower changed the course of the empire. Justinian stayed, the rebellion was crushed, the empire was saved. By a woman who once performed for coins in taverns. But centuries later, her courage has been reduced to a parenthesis. What survives most often is the scandal, her origins, her body, her alleged indecencies. Not her governance, not her reforms, not her unflinching presence during one of the empire's darkest hours. Just the old refrain, once a performer, always a problem. And so Theodora joins the hall of infamous queens not because she failed, but because she succeeded too well. She refused to be ashamed, and for that, she became legend. But while Theodora's legacy was wrapped in theatre and reimagined as myth, across the seas and centuries later, another woman cloaked not in stage makeup but in embroidered silk would be accused of similarly scandalous indulgences, not for saving an empire, but for ruling behind its veils. In the Forbidden City, whispers would swirl around a dowager so powerful she reshaped dynasties, and so reviled they said she could not sleep without a fresh young man at her side. Her name was Empress Dowager, Cixi. Empress Dowager, Cixi. There is no hallway in the Forbidden City untouched by rumor. No jade wall so polished that it doesn't echo with the whispers of eunuchs, ministers, and concubines who have long since turned to dust. And yet among the many shadows that loom large over imperial China, one remains darker, louder, and more unnerving than the rest. Empress Dowager Cixi. She wasn't born to rule. She was born into the gentry, comfortable, educated, modestly connected, and entered the Qing imperial harem at the age of 16. A concubine of the Xianfeng emperor, she distinguished herself not by beauty alone but by something more dangerous, intelligence. When she gave birth to the emperor's only surviving son in 1856, her position solidified. When the emperor died the next year, leaving their 5-year-old son as heir, her power began. She ruled first behind a screen, literally. As one of 2 regents, the other being the Empress Dowager Xian Cixi, issued edicts from behind a silkscreen, while male officials addressed the young boy, pretending he was in charge. This arrangement satisfied appearances but fooled no one. Cixi was the engine behind the throne, and almost immediately, the stories began. They accused her of manipulating court rituals for personal gain, of orchestrating purges under the guise of reform, of installing puppet emperors and then pulling the strings with lacquered fingers. But most memorably and most frequently, they accused her of indulgence, specifically sexual indulgence. The rumors insisted that she was insatiable, that she used eunuchs not just for advice or administrative support, but for more private purposes. Others claimed she ordered the recruitment of young, handsome guards solely for her entertainment. The Forbidden City, they said, wasn't just an imperial palace, it was her private playground. But what all these tales have in common is their breathtaking lack of evidence. They rely on insinuation, on bitter memoirs from disgraced officials, on Western diplomats projecting their own Orientalist fantasies onto the palace walls. Cixi was never caught in scandal, never officially reprimanded, never overthrown, and yet her memory is thick with accusations, not because she was immoral, but because she ruled for nearly half a century in a system designed to keep her invisible. It didn't help that she ruled during decline. The Qing dynasty, already weakened by internal rebellion and foreign intervention, was collapsing in slow motion. To her critics, Cixi became the symbol of everything wrong with the empire. They ignored the reality that she inherited a sinking ship and chose instead to blame her for the storm. Was she conservative? Yes. She suppressed reform movements, executed dissidents, and prioritized stability over modernization. But she was also pragmatic. She invested in infrastructure, created the navy, however flawed its management may have been, and maneuvered through the endless maze of palace intrigue with astonishing skill. She wasn't trying to bring China into the 20th century, she was trying to keep it from disappearing entirely in the 19th. So why the fixation on her private life? Because like so many powerful women before her, Cixi's politics couldn't be openly challenged, so her body was made the battleground. Her opponents couldn't stop her policies, so they rewrote her as a villainess in silk slippers, prowling the palace halls in search of fresh victims. The subtext was always the same. If a woman rises to power, it must be through corruption, political, sexual, or both. The foreign press loved this narrative. Western diplomats described her as decadent, dangerous, exotic, a figure pulled from the pages of an opium dream rather than an administrative ledger. And when she resisted foreign influence, they took it as proof of her irrationality, her femininity, her supposed weakness. But Empress Dowager Cixi was not weak. She survived assassinations, coups, colonial pressures, and civil war. She outlived her enemies, outmaneuvered her rivals, and died with her title intact. She may not have modernized China in the way her successors wished she had, but she didn't let it fracture into pieces, either. And in the face of overwhelming male hostility, both domestic and international, she maintained her rule not by hiding, but by mastering the very court that wanted to erase her. She died in 1908. The empire died 3 years later. And for over a century, Cixi's name became synonymous with decay, seduction, and imperial decline, a reputation that said more about her critics than it did about her. Because the truth is, she ruled too long, too effectively, and too unapologetically for a world that still preferred its women silent and ceremonial. But not all queens were content to remain in velvet prison. Some rejected the entire idea of courtly obedience, threw away their thrones, and lived as provocations in human form dressed not for pageantry, but for rebellion. Like Christina of Sweden, a queen who scandalized Europe simply by refusing to marry and refusing to behave. Christina of Sweden. She was crowned as a girl, ruled as a skeptic, and abdicated as a legend. Christina of Sweden, born in 1626 to King Gustavus Adolphus, and raised with the mind of a philosopher and the manners of a soldier, never fit into the script that had been written for her. And the more she deviated, the more the world insisted that something must be wrong with her. From the very beginning, Christina was not what people expected. Her birth was greeted with disappointment not because she was unwelcome, but because she was not, in fact, a boy. Yet her father, a warrior king with an eye for potential, declared her his heir anyway. He died when she was 6, killed in battle, leaving behind a daughter raised not for marriage, but for mastery. She studied Latin, philosophy, statecraft, and war. She trained in fencing and politics. She surrounded herself with artists, scientists, and thinkers, collecting ideas the way others collected fine porcelain. Her court in Stockholm became a glittering hub of European intellectualism, drawing minds like Descartes, whom she invited to teach her philosophy, and who promptly died in the Swedish cold. But Christina's intellect wasn't what made her a scandal. It was her refusal, outright, unapologetic, to be the kind of queen the world could comfortably digest. She refused to marry. Ever. Despite pressure from every possible direction, her council, her advisors, foreign courts, the people of Sweden, she insisted that marriage was not for her. She called the institution a kind of bondage. She had no interest in producing heirs, no patience for being reduced to a womb with a crown. Her decision was not a private affair, it was a public provocation. And then there were her favourites. Women, mostly, occasionally men. Handsome courtiers and clever ladies in waiting who shared her confidence, her chambers, and according to endless speculation, her affections. She was known to appear in masculine dress, to joke crudely, to dominate conversations in a way that defied every rule of royal femininity. She called herself king as often as queen. In portraits, she was rendered with strong features, stiff posture, and an ambiguous elegance that challenged both gender and decorum. Naturally, the accusations followed. Whispers turned into pamphlets. Her private relationships were dissected in public, and her rejection of heteronormative roles was painted as deviance. Some claimed she was possessed by unnatural appetites. Others said she was unstable, unfit, erratic, and perhaps, secretly, not fully a woman at all. What do you do with a queen who doesn't want to marry, doesn't want to rule like a man or a woman, and doesn't want to apologize for either? You say she's perverse. You say she's unnatural. You call her a queen of contradictions, and then pretend that contradiction is the same as corruption. In 1654, at the age of 28, Christina did something few monarchs ever do voluntarily. She gave it all up. She abdicated the throne of Sweden, packed her books and her jewels, and left the country she had ruled with sharp words and sharper instincts. Her official explanation was exhaustion and disillusionment. The unofficial one was even more shocking. She had converted to Catholicism. Quietly, gradually, and dangerously. In Protestant Sweden, this was not just spiritual, it was political treason. She fled south, eventually landing in Rome, where she became an icon of papal curiosity. The Vatican welcomed her like a trophy, the heretic queen turned devout penitent. But even there, Christina didn't play by the rules. She continued to wear male clothes, to surround herself with beautiful people of ambiguous relationships, to commission art that made cardinals wince. She lived out her life as a queen without a kingdom, floating between palaces and salons, refusing to be reduced to anyone's fantasy. Her funeral in 1689 was attended with full papal honours. The woman who had once shaken the Protestant world was now buried in the crypt of St. Peter's Basilica, one of only a handful of women ever to receive that honour. And yet, in most accounts, she remains a curiosity, a footnote, a queer riddle, wrapped in lace and rebellion. But Christina wasn't confused. She was deliberate. She lived, dressed, ruled, and loved according to her own logic, not the world's Mari. And that logic terrified people, because it didn't offer them a simple answer. Was she a woman who wanted to be a man, a queen who scorned her crown, a sinner masquerading as a saint? Or was she just someone who saw the script and decided to write her own ending? And if that unsettled the world, well, that was the point. Yet while Christina chose her exile and sculpted her identity with artful defiance, the next queen had no such luxury. She was born into power and madness, dragged into legend by a story too strange to forget, a tale of love, loss, and a corpse that wouldn't let go. They called her Joanna la Loca. Joanna la Loca. The crown fit her head, but the world insisted it didn't fit her mind. Joanna of Castile, known to history by the nickname La Loca, the Mad, was never supposed to rule. Born in 1479 to Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the famed Catholic monarchs of Spain, she was a royal daughter with a pedigree of conquest, piety, and empire. A spare, not the heir. Her siblings were groomed for power. Joanna was groomed for marriage. But the line of succession proved unstable. Siblings died, children failed to survive. One by one, the others fell away, until Joanna, brilliant, melancholic, passionate, found herself next in line to one of the largest and most powerful kingdoms in Europe. And that's when her story became inconvenient. By then, Joanna had already been married off to Philip the Handsome of Habsburg fame, a union designed more for diplomacy than domestic harmony. He was dashing, yes, but he was also cold, calculating, and, in the fashion of European royal husbands, faithless. She adored him, obsessively by some accounts. That love, or what came of it, would become her downfall. At first, she was simply intense. Court officials noted her strong feelings, her sharp intelligence, her awkwardness with protocol. She didn't perform the role of quiet queen with the expected grace. She spoke out of turn. She challenged her husband. She showed too much emotion, and not the right kind. But once Philip began taking mistresses more openly, Joanna's behavior became harder to control, or, at least, harder to contain. She was jealous, erratic, fiercely wounded by his betrayals. She quarreled with him in public, sometimes refusing food, sometimes locking herself away. These were not, by the standards of the time, acceptable royal behaviors. Not because they were particularly shocking, but because they were visible, unignorable. So the murmurs began. She's unstable. She's over-emotional. She's unfit. And then, in a quiet but deliberate turn, she became mad. But madness in the early 16th century was not a diagnosis, it was a weapon, a legal strategy, a royal containment plan. And for Joanna, it worked devastatingly well. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, still young, likely from a fever, Joanna was devastated. According to chroniclers, she refused to part with his body. She travelled with the coffin, allegedly opening it to gaze at his face, dressing it, kissing it, talking to it. The stories became more elaborate over time. They claimed she dragged the corpse across Castile on a grim procession, forbidding any woman to come near it out of fear that someone might seduce her dead husband. It's impossible now to separate fact from fable. Did she mourn unconventionally? Yes. Did she transport his body to a royal burial site over several months, refusing to bury him until he could be interred in proper Catholic soil? Yes. But was this madness or just grief the world didn't know how to look at in a queen? Her political rights were quietly stripped. First her father, Ferdinand, declared her unfit to rule. Then her son, Charles, later Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, continued the charade. Joanna, though queen in title, was imprisoned in the royal palace of Tordesillas for the last 46 years of her life. Not tried, not sentenced, just kept. Out of sight. Her signature was still used on royal decrees, but she was not allowed to govern, travel, or even speak freely. She was a living symbol rendered inert. And all because she felt too much. Because her grief was inconvenient. Because her devotion to a deeply flawed man couldn't be shaped into a clean public story. For centuries, Joanna has been remembered as a tragic curiosity, the queen who lost her mind for love, the corpse-kissing widow, the madwoman in the tower. But when you strip away the myth, what remains is something far more unsettling. A woman whose political power was taken from her under the guise of mental instability, whose humanity was weaponized against her, and whose story has been smothered under a velvet cloak of half-truths and courtly horror. She was never overthrown, never deposed in battle, just labelled, diagnosed without evidence, and then quietly erased. Yet Joanna's story didn't vanish. It lingered in the background of every queen who came after her, a silent reminder that too much emotion, too much grief, or too much love could all be framed as perversion, especially when they got in the way of male ambition. And speaking of queens who were placed on trial not for treason but for loving the wrong way, the next woman wasn't confined to a tower. She was dragged into a courtroom, paraded before Parliament, and humiliated on a public stage for doing what her husband had done 100 times over without consequence. Her name was Caroline of Brunswick, Queen Caroline of Brunswick. To understand Queen Caroline of Brunswick, you must first understand her husband, or rather, the man history insists on calling her husband. George IV, Prince Regent, future King of Britain, eternal cautionary tale of powdered excess and velvet entitlement. A man whose appetites outpaced his charm and whose vanity outlasted his morals. He was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a loyal partner. But then again, Caroline never wanted a love story. She wanted a position. Theirs was a political marriage, arranged in the grand tradition of European dynastic entanglements. She was German nobility, the daughter of the Duke of Brunswick, and George, chronically in debt and desperate to appease Parliament, was in need of a respectable union. By the time they met in 1795, he had already secretly married a Catholic woman, Maria Fitzherbert, which disqualified her from being queen. Parliament frowned. The Crown frowned. His father frowned louder. So he agreed to marry Caroline, a Protestant, well-bred, and, most importantly, useful. The meeting was a disaster. He took one look at her and reportedly asked for brandy. She was unimpressed by him too, though she at least had the decency not to say so in front of the help. Still, the marriage proceeded. Their wedding night was a catastrophe. 9 months later, they had a daughter. Princess Charlotte, their one and only act of marital unity. Within days, George left her. From then on, Caroline was a wife in name only. The prince returned to his mistresses, to his opulent lifestyle, and to his endless theatrical displays of royal importance. Caroline, now sidelined and isolated, became a figure of public curiosity. She was neither loved nor loathed, merely pitied. But she was not content to remain a prop in her husband's pageant. She travelled, made friends, built alliances. She surrounded herself with people who didn't particularly care about court etiquette, including foreign artists, musicians, and advisors, many of them men. And predictably, the rumours followed. She was said to be too familiar with her male companions, too affectionate, too free. When she took up residence in Italy and hired a handsome servant named Bartolomeo Pergami, the tabloids practically caught fire. He travelled with her, dined with her, shared close quarters. To the British elite, this was not evidence, but it was enough. They didn't need confirmation. They needed a story, and Caroline had provided one. In 1820, George became king, and instead of allowing the matter to fade, he went on the offensive. He wanted her stripped of her title, publicly, loudly, and permanently. Thus began the Pains and Penalties Bill, an attempt to not only divorce her, but to declare her guilty of adultery and deny her the right to be queen. The trial was a spectacle, dripping in hypocrisy. George had fathered illegitimate children, kept mistresses in rotating cycles, and had once been legally barred from marrying the woman he loved due to his own behaviour. But none of that mattered. Caroline was the one on trial. Witnesses were brought in, many of them questionable, some clearly bribed. Tales of late-night boat rides and shared bedrooms were spun into accusations of royal corruption. The British public, already weary of George's arrogance and opulence, rallied to Caroline's side. They saw in her not just a queen, but a victim, a woman shamed for doing what powerful men did every day without consequence. Crowds cheered for her outside the courtroom. Pamphlets circulated with her likeness. Satirical cartoons mocked George as bloated and bitter while portraying Caroline as wronged and dignified. In the end, the bill failed. The trial collapsed under the weight of its own farce. Caroline was never legally found guilty, though her reputation was bruised beyond repair. Still, she returned to Britain and demanded to be crowned queen beside George. He refused. On the day of his coronation, she attempted to enter Westminster Abbey and was physically turned away from every door. It was a public humiliation of historic proportions. Less than a month later, she fell ill and died. The official record said inflammation of the intestines. The poetic record said heartbreak. Caroline's story was never about guilt or innocence. It was about control, about what happens when a woman refuses to play her assigned role, refuses to be silent, refuses to disappear quietly into exile. She was mocked not because she was monstrous, but because she made monarchy look human, and in the royal imagination, that is unforgivable. Still, the stage of scandal needed its next act, and few acts have ever been staged with more deliberate cruelty than the one that followed. Across the Channel, another queen's name would be dragged through the filth not by trial, but by pamphlet. Not for infidelity, but for the mere suggestion of pleasure. Her enemies said she corrupted France. They said she danced too much, laughed too loudly, touched the wrong women, and kissed the wrong men. They called her Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." That line was assigned to her by a public that had already decided what kind of woman she was: extravagant, aloof, corrupt, and, above all, perverse. The truth didn't matter. The legend was easier to swallow than the complex reality of a queen trapped in a collapsing kingdom and a body politic that needed someone, anyone, to blame. She was born Maria Antonia of Austria in 1755, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa. Her marriage to the Dauphin of France, the future Louis XVI, was never about love. It was a diplomatic handshake between empires. At age 14, she left everything behind: her language, her family, even her name, to become France's newest symbol of continuity and fertility. Instead, she became the embodiment of national anxiety. From the beginning, Marie Antoinette was a target. Her Austrian heritage made her suspect. Her beauty made her visible. Her unfamiliarity with French customs made her an easy mark for gossip. And the marriage, to make matters worse, was slow to produce heirs. The young couple's apparent lack of intimacy became court legend, dissected by courtiers, ridiculed in salons, and eventually weaponized by the press. In the absence of real scandal, the people invented one. Libel's underground pamphlets full of political satire, softcore fantasy, and rage disguised as rhetoric flooded France in the years leading up to the Revolution. They depicted Marie Antoinette as a woman consumed by appetite, sexual, financial, emotional. She was cast as a libertine in pearls, a schemer in lace. One moment she was seducing guards and governesses. The next, she was bankrupting the nation to furnish her gardens with fake villages and gold-plated chickens. She was accused of hosting orgies in the halls of Versailles, of corrupting her female friends, of engaging in affairs with men, women, and sometimes both. Her friendships with figures like the Princess de Lamballe and the Duchess of Polignac were framed not as alliances but as indecent liaisons. The drawings were explicit, the language cruel, the implications clear. This queen wasn't just a bad ruler, she was a moral contagion. And yet, for all the noise, there was precious little evidence of wrongdoing. Marie Antoinette spent most of her time buried in court rituals and the endless tedium of royal expectation. When she escaped, it wasn't into scandal, but into carefully curated fantasy, like her miniature village at Petit Trianon, where she played shepherdess in embroidered gowns, trying to carve out a private life in the world's most public palace. Yes, she spent lavishly. Yes, she made mistakes, but her spending was not unique among royals. What made her spending intolerable was the context, a nation spiraling into poverty, famine, and revolution. The Queen became the face of aristocratic excess, a living metaphor for everything the people could not afford and would no longer tolerate. And so, they rewrote her. Marie Antoinette became the central figure in a theatre of national catharsis. Her reputation was not assassinated by one scandal, but by 1,000 cuts. A necklace she never ordered, lovers she never took, parties she never attended. The pamphlets were not concerned with accuracy, they were concerned with effect, and the effect was devastating. By the time the revolution erupted, the image of Marie Antoinette as a foreign temptress had become political doctrine. When she stood trial years later, the charges read like the script of a nightmare. She was accused not only of treason and extravagance, but of corrupting her own son, a charge so grotesque even her accusers hesitated. She denied it with quiet fury, but the damage had long been done. The crowd didn't want facts, they wanted a villain. She was executed in 1793, just shy of her 38th birthday. She walked to the scaffold in a plain white dress, her hair cut short, her spine straight. The woman who had once symbolized untouchable luxury now symbolized something far more unsettling, the fragility of power in the face of myth. Marie Antoinette's real crime was being too visible, too foreign, and too female, in a moment that demanded blood. She was not the architect of France's ruin, but she made an excellent scapegoat, and like so many queens before her supposed perversion wasn't about behavior, it was about presence. The sheer fact that she existed in the wrong body, at the wrong time, in the wrong palace. But where Marie Antoinette had fantasy weaponized against her, the next queen used fantasy as a tool of terror. She didn't rule in pearls and powdered wigs, she ruled with fire and steel. Her kingdom was an island, her method was fear, her name was Ranavalona, and she didn't need a scandal to shock her subjects. She was the scandal. Queen Ranavalona, I, Madagascar. If Marie Antoinette was condemned for the fantasy of decadence, Ranavalona I was vilified for the reality of defiance. She ruled not with seduction or softness, but with iron resolve and a paranoia that, depending on who you asked, either saved Madagascar from colonial control or plunged it into an era of calculated cruelty. Either way, she refused to be managed, and for that she was branded a savage, a tyrant, and, inevitably, something darker, perversely unnatural. Born in 1778 as Ramavo, she was never in line for the throne. Her ascent came by marriage and strategic positioning, helped along by a prophecy, a few powerful allies, and the conveniently timed deaths of rivals. When her husband, King Radama I, died in 1828, Ranavalona acted quickly, outmaneuvering other contenders, seizing power before the royal court could react, and cementing her place as sovereign of the Marina Kingdom, the dominant power on the island of Madagascar. But Ranavalona didn't just inherit a throne. She inherited a land on the brink under pressure from expanding European empires, particularly Britain and France, whose missionaries, merchants, and military advisors were beginning to tangle their influence through the highlands like creeping vines. Her predecessor had welcomed them. Ranavalona slammed the gates shut. Her reign was isolationist, nationalistic, and unapologetically ruthless. She expelled Christian missionaries, executed converts, and rolled back foreign alliances. But it wasn't just about religion or politics, it was about survival. She believed, rightly or wrongly, that Madagascar could only stay free if it stayed pure. That meant rejecting foreign influence and rooting out internal threats, and she did so with methods that would earn her a reputation as one of the most feared female rulers in world history. But fear, as always, is fertile ground for myth. Among the more sensational rumors that she forced men into brutal loyalty tests, challenges that involved drinking poison or walking across sharp spears to prove their faithfulness. That she used human sacrifice not just as punishment but as demonstration. That her palace rituals included dances where prisoners were made to entertain her before being put to death. Even that she derived pleasure from the spectacle itself. There's little hard evidence to support the more lurid details. Much of what we know or think we know about Ranavalona's reign comes from the letters and diaries of European missionaries and envoys, most of whom were deeply opposed to her rule. They viewed her not just as a political obstacle, but as a moral aberration, a woman who governed without European guidance and rejected Christianity as imperial poison. To them, her rejection of their values couldn't be political, it had to be pathological. She was perverse not because of what she did, but because of what she refused to accept. Foreign trade, Western religion, colonial law, a submissive role. And because she was a woman doing this alone, without a male regent or husband in the wings, she was doubly intolerable. One British writer called her the female Caligula. Another described her as a demon in human form. French accounts labelled her bloodthirsty and mad. They emphasised her punishments, her rituals, her alleged sadism. But they said very little about her strategic genius, about how she consolidated her power through alliances with provincial nobles, or how she built a complex spy network to monitor threats. They ignored how she preserved a fragile autonomy for nearly 3 decades in a century, when most of Africa was being carved up like a feast. Ranavalona's reign was undeniably harsh. Estimates suggest tens of thousands may have died under her rule due to purges, military campaigns, and forced labour. But her motives were not those of a deranged despot. They were the instincts of a ruler defending her land from a threat she recognised long before others did. The creeping annexation of culture, economy, and identity. Still, her reputation was sealed. A woman who dared to defy Europe and who ruled with severity rather than charm could only be framed as monstrous. The fact that she remained unmarried for most of her reign and that her relationships were opaque and politically calculated gave way to speculation that she was cold, unfeeling, unnatural. Some said she enjoyed her executions. Others claimed she tested lovers the way she tested courtiers, and that few passed. And so, like so many women before her, Ranavalona became less a person and more a legend. But her legend was not built from perfume and poetry. It was forged from firewood and steel. She was not seductive, she was impenetrable. And in the colonial imagination, that was the most perverse trait of all. She died in 1861, undefeated. Her son, more conciliatory, would eventually reopen Madagascar to foreign influence. But the mother who raised him had already made her mark. A woman who ruled without apology, and whose power was measured not by affection, but by endurance. And yet, as terrifying as Ranavalona appeared to her enemies, she still existed at a historical remove, an exotic warning on the edge of the European world. The next name on our list, much closer to home, a noblewoman soaked in blood-soaked legend, who bathed literally, they said, in the lifeblood of innocence. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory, and the world called her something else entirely, the Blood Countess, Elizabeth Bathory, Hungary. She was born into privilege, raised in opulence, and married into power. Yet, Elizabeth Bathory is remembered not for her wealth or status, but for the centuries of gore-soaked legend that eventually drowned her legacy. Known to history as the Blood Countess, she has been described as the most prolific female killer of all time. a vampire in a velvet gown, a noblewoman who bathed in the blood of girls to preserve her youth. That image, morbid, lurid, and sensational, is what is endured. But behind the folklore lies a woman far more complex and a court intrigue far more calculated. Born in 1560 to one of the most powerful Protestant noble families in the Kingdom of Hungary, Elizabeth Bathory grew up with the kind of access and education few women of her time could imagine. She spoke several languages, studied science, philosophy, and was even literate in Latin, a rarity for her class and gender. At the age of 15, she married Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a military hero from an equally powerful family. Their union wasn't built on love, but on land, lineage, and leveraged the usual cocktail. While Ferenc was often away fighting the Ottomans, Elizabeth managed the vast family estates with sharp efficiency. She oversaw legal disputes, financial matters, agricultural production, and a rotating staff of servants and tutors. She was, by many accounts, an effective administrator. And it is precisely this visibility, this autonomy that made her vulnerable. Because when powerful men disappear into war and powerful women stay behind to run empires, the whispers tend to follow. The accusations began years after her husband's death in 1604. Rumors circulated that girls, peasant girls, servants, sometimes even minor nobles were entering her castle and never returning. Witnesses, often under duress or seeking favor, claimed to have seen everything from beatings to occult rituals. The most enduring tale, of course, was that Elizabeth bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her beauty. It was a fable too grotesque to ignore and too useful to question. The story took root not because it was proven, but because it was cinematic, and because her enemies needed it to be true. Bathory had no shortage of them. After Ferenc's death, she became the most powerful widow in the region, controlling enormous tracts of land and wealth. More importantly, she had no male guardian, no husband, no son old enough to rule in her stead. She was a sovereign in everything but name, and that made her dangerous. One of her chief accusers was Count György Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, a man with both legal authority and a vested interest in diminishing her power. In 1610, he orchestrated a dramatic raid of her castle. According to his report, Bathory was caught in the act, surrounded by mutilated bodies. The evidence, however, was never formally presented in court. No trial was held. No confession was made. Instead, Elizabeth was quietly confined to a room in her castle, a makeshift prison from which she would never emerge. She died 4 years later, her official crime unproven, her name already mythologized into monstrosity. So what do we make of the legend? The idea that she bathed in blood appears nowhere in contemporary documents. It first appeared over a century later in the writings of authors eager to capitalize on the rising popularity of Gothic horror. It stuck because it was horrifying, because it confirmed what society already wanted to believe, that a woman with too much power, too much privacy, and too little oversight must be hiding something unspeakable behind those high stone walls. Elizabeth Bathory was not the first noblewoman accused of bloodlust, and she wouldn't be the last. But she may be the most enduring. Her tale has been adapted into plays, books, films, and even video games. She's become shorthand for female cruelty, a chilling counterpoint to the damsel archetype, a queen not of hearts, but of daggers. But perhaps the most perverse part of her story isn't what she did, but what was done to her legacy. Her supposed crimes were inflated by hearsay, fueled by politics, and hardened into folklore by generations who never asked who stood to gain from her downfall. It's not innocence we're left with, it's ambiguity. The unsettling sense that the real Elizabeth, the woman who managed castles, negotiated debts, and wrote letters in 4 languages, was erased beneath the weight of a fantasy built for her destruction. And if the world believed that a powerful widow bathed in blood to stay young, it was only because it preferred to believe that over the truth that she outlived her usefulness. But the world would not stop punishing women who failed to be ornamental. The next queen on our list was punished not with legends, but with execution, a young woman condemned for her alleged lusts, her youthful indiscretions, and the terrible sin of being caught. She was married to a king. She was still a teenager, and she was dead before 20. Her name was Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard, England. She arrived at court with laughter in her eyes and a crown in her future. By the time she left, she was barefoot, weeping, and 19 years old. Catherine Howard, 5th wife of Henry VIII, was neither the first nor the last woman to fall under the weight of Tudor expectations, but she might be the most tragic. Not because of her crimes, but because of how little it took to end her. Catherine was a Howard. That meant noble blood, yes, but not necessarily noble behaviour. The Howards were an ambitious family, with a talent for navigating court life, and an even greater talent for marrying off their daughters like diplomatic chess pieces. Catherine, a distant cousin of Anne Boleyn, was raised in a chaotic household, overseen by her grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. It was more boarding house than palace, a rotating cast of minor aristocrats, wayward wards, and under-supervised adolescents. This was where Catherine grew up, not in the sheltered refinement of a future queen, but in a world full of whispered flirtations, half-secrets, and scandal waiting to ripen. When she was around 13 or 14, she began to attract the attention of men. Music teachers, household gentlemen, men older, more experienced, and more than willing to exploit the lack of structure around her. Whether these early encounters were consensual by modern standards is a question for another context, but in Tudor terms, they were damning, and they would come back to haunt her. Catherine was still in her teens when she was brought to court as a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's 4th wife. The king, bloated and bitter, found little joy in his German bride, and soon turned his attentions to the young, vivacious Catherine. She was everything Anne was not: flirtatious, delicate, English. A songbird in the shadow of a collapsing marriage. The attraction was instant on Henry's part, at least. Catherine, like most women at court, didn't have the luxury of refusal. They married in 1540. He was 49. She was probably 17. The king called her his rose without a thorn. The court called her the very mirror of feminine youth. But roses have thorns, whether you notice them or not, and youth in Tudor England was a dangerous form of currency spent quickly and never refunded. As queen, Catherine played the part expected of her. She dressed in silks and jewels, danced at banquets, charmed foreign ambassadors, and kept the king entertained no small feat given his leg ulcers, paranoia, and sour temperament. She also extended patronage to her friends and former companions, including some young men whose presence would later be used as evidence against her. Because Catherine had a secret, or several, before she married Henry, she had been involved in a romantic relationship with a man named Francis Derham, whom she reportedly referred to as her fiancé. After her marriage, she allegedly began an affair with Thomas Culpeper, a favoured courtier and known charmer. Whether these relationships continued in full after her wedding is still debated, but the court didn't need facts, it needed scandal. And once whispers began, they spread like wildfire through a dry forest of resentment and ambition. In 1541, less than 2 years into her queenship, the accusations surfaced. Her past, once hidden or ignored, was dragged into public view. Investigators interrogated former servants, pried into her childhood, and extracted confessions from frightened mouths. Derham was arrested, so was Culpeper. Both were tortured. Both implicated Catherine. The charges weren't just about adultery, they were about treason. For a queen to betray the king was not merely immoral, it was criminal. Her private life, once whispered about in silk-draped corners, became a legal case discussed in Parliament. She was placed under house arrest, stripped of her royal status, and interrogated until she collapsed. The young girl who had once danced in the palace now wandered its halls in a trance, asking for forgiveness that would never come. On the 13th of February, 1542, Catherine Howard was executed at the Tower of London. According to legend, she asked for the executioner's block to be brought to her the night before so she could practice placing her head upon it. Whether true or not, the image lingers a queen rehearsing her own death because she had dared to be young, desired, and naive in a world that demanded silence and virtue. The narrative around Catherine has always been soaked in judgment. She was called foolish, wanton, reckless, a cautionary tale in a jeweled collar. But what she really was, perhaps, was a girl caught between a decaying monarchy and a court hungry for blood. Her so-called perversion wasn't deviance. It was defiance of decorum, of control, of the cold machinery of Tudor politics. And she wouldn't be the last to face that machinery. Because a few years earlier, another young queen had lost her head under nearly identical charges, accused of adultery, incest, and sorcery, branded a manipulator, and turned into a national obsession before being neatly removed. Her name was Anne Boleyn, and she, too, was supposed to be perfect. Anne Boleyn, England. Anne Boleyn, England. By the time Anne Boleyn climbed the steps to the scaffold in May of 1536, her story had already been rewritten into myth. The real woman, sharp-tongued, politically agile, and dangerously ambitious, had been buried beneath a pile of accusations that ranged from adultery to incest to witchcraft. She was no longer Queen of England. She was a cautionary tale, draped in silks and suspicion. But before she was a threat, she was a novelty. Anne entered the English court not as a seductress, but as a lady-in-waiting, first in the Netherlands, then in France, and finally in the household of Queen Catherine of Aragon. She had been educated abroad, where she learned courtly manners, theology, music, and politics, and, more importantly, how to survive a system designed to overlook women like her. She was not the most beautiful woman at court, but she was magnetic, witty, teasing, unapologetically clever. King Henry VIII, married for nearly 2 decades to Catherine, had grown increasingly frustrated by his wife's failure to produce a male heir. He already had mistresses. One of them had even been Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn. But Anne was different. She refused to become just another dalliance. She wanted more, and he wanted her. So began one of the most infamous political seductions in European history. Their courtship dragged on for nearly 7 years. Henry, desperate to marry her, broke from the Catholic Church when the Pope refused to annul his first marriage. The result was the English Reformation, a seismic religious shift, born not out of spiritual conviction, but out of desire and royal impatience. When they finally married in 1533, Henry was nearly unrecognizable. Once a golden prince, now a king, increasingly paranoid, volatile, and obsessed with control. Anne, crowned Queen of England, had staked her life on producing a son. She gave him a daughter. That daughter, Elizabeth, would go on to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. But at the time, she was a disappointment. The pressure on Anne to conceive again and deliver a male heir intensified. Her subsequent pregnancies ended in miscarriage and stillbirth. The king's affections cooled, his eyes wandered, and the court began to whisper. Anne was not beloved. She had displaced a queen who had ruled for 20 years, a queen who was Spanish, devoutly Catholic, and deeply popular. Anne's rise had been scandalous, her personality divisive, her reforms unsettling. She encouraged religious reformers, challenged traditional power structures, and wasn't afraid to argue with the king not exactly a winning combination in the Tudor court. Her enemies were waiting, and when the opportunity came, they moved swiftly. In 1536, Anne was arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and plotting the king's death. The charges were, by any rational measure, absurd. She was accused of having affairs with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The trial was a performance. Witnesses were coerced. Evidence was invented. Her so-called lovers were executed first among them, talented courtiers, musicians, and her brother. Anne followed shortly after. At her execution, she spoke with poise. No recriminations, no pleas, just a prayer and a carefully chosen silence. The king, ever theatrical, had brought in a swordsman from France to carry out the beheading, a final gesture of elegance for the woman he once swore to love above all others. So how did Anne become a symbol of perversion? Because she wanted power, because she negotiated for marriage, because she demanded to be more than ornamental. Her refusal to submit first to the king's advances, then to the court's expectations made her dangerous, her intelligence made her suspect, and her failure to produce a son made her expendable. After her death, the narratives only grew darker. Catholic propagandists portrayed her as a witch who had bewitched the king and cursed the realm. Her 6th finger, likely a myth, was cited as evidence of supernatural evil. Her sexuality was painted as predatory. Her downfall was used as a morality tale. The woman who reached too high, seduced too well, and was punished for both. But Anne's real legacy is more complicated. She helped birth a religious revolution, raised one of history's most formidable queens, and changed the fabric of English monarchy. Her story was never just about love or betrayal, it was about transformation. And transformation, when it comes from a woman, is always treated with suspicion. Anne Boleyn wasn't destroyed because she sinned. She was destroyed because she refused to be silent. And, in the end, the court didn't want a queen. It wanted a shadow in a dress, someone who knew her place and never asked for more. But Anne wasn't the only royal woman who fell under suspicion for wanting more. Across the Iberian Peninsula, another queen was being accused of sins far less defined and far more corrosive. Lust, instability, and emotional excess, the old trinity of female disqualification. Her name was Isabella of Portugal, and her crown was heavier than it looked. Isabella of Portugal. History remembers kings as strategists, warriors, and reformers. Queens, on the other hand, are often remembered as problems, emotional problems, political problems, or, when convenient, moral problems. Isabella of Portugal, Empress of the Holy Roman Empire and Queen of Spain by marriage, was none of the above. She was dutiful, diplomatic, and, for the most part, deliberately restrained. And yet even she was not immune to the insidious logic of royal suspicion, where silence becomes complicity, composure becomes manipulation, and affection becomes perversion. Born in 1503, Isabella was the daughter of Manuel I of Portugal and Maria of Aragon, making her deeply embedded in the vast family web of European monarchy. At 18, she married her first cousin, Charles V, a man whose titles barely fit on the page, King of Spain, Archduke of Austria, and Holy Roman Emperor. Their marriage was political, of course, but also curiously affectionate by royal standards. Charles reportedly fell for her completely, or at least as much as a man constantly at war could fall for anyone. While Charles spent much of his reign fighting battles across Europe, Isabella governed in his absence. As regent of Spain, she was no figurehead. She managed rebellions, balanced court factions, dealt with religious disputes, and upheld the day-to-day operations of a kingdom stretching across continents. She was intelligent, calm under pressure, and profoundly loyal to the Habsburg cause. Her correspondence with Charles reveals not only affection, but strategic understanding. She wasn't just reporting to him, she was advising him. And yet, beneath all that stability, a whispering campaign began to build. Small at first, like a crack in porcelain. Some said she was too intense, that her affections for Charles bordered on obsession. Others claimed she was too emotional, too tied to her role as wife, too overwhelmed by grief when separated from him. When she mourned his absences with letters and symbolic gestures, her behavior was interpreted as weakness, even hysteria. And when she died suddenly in 1539 at the age of 35 after a stillbirth, her legacy was hijacked first by eulogies, then by rumours. Charles, reportedly devastated, withdrew from public life for weeks. He kept her portrait with him for the rest of his life, had a room permanently arranged as a shrine to her memory, and ordered that fresh flowers be placed in it daily. Poets and diplomats alike noted his grief, but grief, when performed by a man, can quickly become something else in the public imagination, and soon enough, the story warped. It wasn't just grief, people whispered. It was something darker. Rumours began to circulate that Charles's mourning was unnatural, that his devotion to Isabella in death went beyond the boundaries of marital sorrow. He was said to speak to her portrait, to keep her clothing, to isolate himself in mourning rituals that became obsessive. These details were not necessarily true, but they were sticky. And because Isabella had always been the quiet one, the supportive one, the moral one, the transformation of her image into something unnatural had even more impact. She became the queen who inspired too much love, the mirror opposite of queens accused of adultery or seduction. Isabella was now portrayed as the ghost who haunted Charles's conscience, a woman whose memory had become a kind of moral prison. And with that narrative came another question. If Charles's grief was so extreme, what had Isabella been in life? Manipulative? Possessive? A temptress in modest dress? Even though her behaviour never scandalised the court, her legacy became increasingly entangled with unspoken implications. Was her power over Charles emotional or calculated? Was her influence born of loyalty or of something more insidious, an emotional dependency that made the empire weaker? These weren't questions posed in public documents, of course, but they lived in the margins, in the gossip, in the chroniclers who couldn't quite understand why a king might break for a woman who had, by all accounts, simply done her job. The absurdity lies in the contradiction. If a queen is too cold, she's called unnatural. If she is too warm, she's called manipulative. If she is politically skilled, she's branded ambitious. If she is submissive, she's erased. Isabella managed to be all these things and none of them, and somehow, still, she ended up a figure of discomfort. She left behind no obvious scandal, no trial, no pamphlets, no public downfall, and yet, even in death, her story was quietly reframed. She became not a ruler, not a regent, not a mother, but a symbol of something too intense to be explained, too uncomfortable to be admired. And the whispers didn't stop at the edge of Spain, because across the Alps, in the poison-laced courts of Renaissance Italy, Another woman would soon be whispered about in corridors and taverns alike, not for how she ruled, but for who she was rumoured to love. Her name was Lucrezia Borgia, and she was beautiful, strategic, deadly, and according to everyone who envied her, deeply unnatural. Lucrezia Borgia, Italy Duchess of Ferrara. Few names conjure the scent of Renaissance scandal like Lucrezia Borgia. Born into power, baptized in political chaos, and immortalized as the poisonous daughter of a pope, she has become shorthand for corruption wrapped in silk. The accusations that trail her name, incest, murder, manipulation, read more like tabloid headlines than historical fact. And yet, for all their absurdity, they stuck. Because Lucrezia Borgia was never allowed to be a woman, she was a warning. She was born in 1480, the illegitimate daughter of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, a Spaniard on the rise in Rome's clerical aristocracy, and his mistress, Vanosa de Catanei. Her father would soon ascend to the papacy as Alexander VI, turning the Borgia family from backroom tacticians into Europe's most scandalous power players. The Borgias were wealthy, ambitious, and unrepentant about both. In a church that preached humility, they built dynasties. In a Rome obsessed with virtue, they trafficked in rumour. Lucrezia's role was clear from the beginning. She was to be beautiful, obedient, and useful. Her marriages would not be personal. They would be diplomatic. Her reputation would not be her own. It would belong to the papacy. Her first engagement came at the age of 11. Her first marriage at 13. By the time she reached adulthood, she had already been married off, annulled, and re-betrothed in a dizzying carousel of alliances. And with each arrangement, the rumours deepened. The earliest scandal involved her first annulled marriage to Giovanni Sforza. The Borgia family claimed it had never been consummated, citing his impotence. Sforza, furious and humiliated, fired back accusing Lucrezia of incest, naming her not just a pawn but a participant in the family's debauchery. He alleged she was her father's lover, and her brother's, and maybe everyone else's too. The story spread like wildfire through Renaissance Italy, a court system that thrived on spectacle and simmered with jealousy. The image of the virginal daughter turned lover was too horrifying, too titillating to ignore. Lucrezia, despite a lack of evidence, was rebranded overnight. Not as a victim of dynastic chess, but as a player in the game, or worse, the game itself. Was there any truth to it? Highly unlikely. There's no credible proof that Lucrezia had inappropriate relations with either her father or her brother, Cesare Borgia. But truth was never the currency of Renaissance gossip. The Borgias were hated for their power, their foreignness, their audacity, and Lucrezia was the softest target. She was young, she was visible, and most dangerously, she was intelligent. Because Lucrezia wasn't merely a pawn. As she grew older, she became more politically adept. She wrote letters in multiple languages, hosted court intellectuals, and handled state affairs in her husband's absence. By the time she was Duchess of Ferrara, married to Alfonso d'Este, in what would become her most stable union, she was no longer just a name. She was an operator. But the old rumours refused to die. Her name remained inseparable from poisons, hidden lovers, and secret passageways. Every death near her was attributed to her hand. Every misfortune became evidence of her malevolence. One persistent myth claimed she owned a hollow ring used to slip poison into drinks. Others insisted her pregnancies were cover for affairs, that her children were secretly fathered by her brother, or her father, or both. What's most remarkable is that none of these rumours ever resulted in formal charges. No trials, no arrests, no confessions, just endless repetition, from chroniclers to playwrights to historians. Lucrezia lived through 3 husbands, multiple children, and the fall of the Borgia dynasty, all while carrying the weight of accusations that would have crushed any lesser figure. In private, she seems to have yearned for something quieter. Her letters reflect tenderness, melancholy, introspection. She wrote poetry, commissioned art. She was deeply religious, especially later in life, and yet, even then, the image of the femme fatale clung to her like smoke to brocade. When she died at 39, weakened by childbirth and stress, the world didn't mourn her. It dissected her. Lucrezia Borgia had spent her life trying to escape the narrative written for her, the one in which beauty and cunning must always equal sin. But the script had been finalized long before she took her first step into a palace corridor. And if Lucrezia was the portrait of perversion, then what of her mother or her daughter? Or the thousands of women across Europe whose reputations hung on the words of bitter men and frightened scribes? Because the story of the perverse queen doesn't end with one generation. It never does. In fact, in ancient Rome, the accusation went even deeper, not just into the bedchamber, but into the very bloodline. The next woman was an empress, a mother, and a murderess, depending on who you asked. She raised a son who would become infamous, and the world whispered she raised him too closely. Her name was Agrippina the Younger, Agrippina the Younger Rome, Empress. Agrippina the Younger was not merely born into power, she was forged in its fire. Her bloodline alone reads like a Roman tragedy. Daughter of Germanicus, niece and fourth wife of Emperor Claudius, sister of Emperor Caligula, mother of Emperor Nero. Her family tree was a tangle of emperors, conspiracies, and sharpened daggers. Survival, for her, wasn't an accident. It was a skill. And like every woman in Rome who dared to practice that skill too well, Agrippina was accused of perversion. The Romans did not take kindly to women who played politics in full daylight. Female influence, they believed, should be subtle, whispered, tucked behind veils and curtains. Agrippina wasn't interested in veils. She ruled openly, not from behind the throne but beside it, sometimes even in front of it. And to justify their unease, her critics did what they always do. They rewrote her as monstrous. Born in 15 CE, Agrippina was a Julio Claudian by birth, which meant her childhood was soaked in both privilege and paranoia. Her father, Germanicus, was a beloved general whose death, likely by poisoning, turned him into a martyr and left young Agrippina with a lifelong understanding of how fragile favor could be. Her mother, Agrippina the Elder, was known for her defiance and eventually exiled. Agrippina the Younger learned early that loyalty in Rome was temporary and love, if it existed at all, was a luxury. She was first married off to Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, a cruel, uninspiring match. Their union produced her only son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, who would later become the infamous Emperor Nero. After her husband's death, Agrippina returned to court life during the reign of her brother Caligula. That reign, as history remembers, was marked by chaos and cruelty, and Agrippina barely survived it. She was exiled for supposed conspiracies and only recalled after Caligula's assassination in 41 CE. What followed was one of the most ambitious power plays in Roman imperial history. Agrippina maneuvered herself into marriage with her uncle, the sitting Emperor Claudius. This union was scandalous even by Roman standards, an incestuous pairing that shocked conservative senators and gave her enemies endless material. But politically, it was brilliant. She became Augusta, empress in name and influence, and used her position to promote her son, Nero, over Claudius's biological son, Britannicus. When Claudius died in 54 CE, possibly poisoned, depending on which version of events you believe Agrippina's son took the throne, she had succeeded. Her son was emperor. Her bloodline had returned to power. And for a moment, she ruled Rome not through a man, but through the man she had raised. That's when the stories began to rot. They said she had murdered Claudius, that she had used mushrooms, the food of the gods, to slip him into death. They said she had seduced her own son, that her influence over Nero was not just maternal, but erotic. Roman historians like Suetonius and Tacitus hinted, and in some cases outright stated, that Agrippina used incest to manipulate the young emperor. No evidence was provided, no witnesses named, just implication weaponized and left to fester. And yet, these same historians also describe Agrippina as intelligent, well-read, politically savvy. They describe her as commanding respect in the Senate, issuing edicts in Nero's name, even sitting with him in audiences before he grew old enough to rule alone. She was a stateswoman. But Rome couldn't process a woman wielding that kind of visibility without framing it as unnatural. By 59 CE, Nero had tired of her influence. Their political alliance fractured. He wanted independence, and more than that, he wanted her gone. The stories of her death are so theatrical they feel like parody. A collapsing boat rigged to kill her, a failed drowning, assassins dispatched when she swam ashore. Eventually, she was murdered in her villa, stabbed by a soldier after Nero gave the order. Even in death, Agrippina couldn't escape narrative control. Her enemies claimed she deserved it, that she had ruled through poison and incest, that she was the ultimate anti-mother, not nurturing, but devouring, not a protector of Rome's legacy, but a corrupter of its future. But the real Agrippina was neither saint nor monster. She was a survivor, a strategist, a woman born into a system that chewed through even its most talented men, and still, she made herself essential. If she had been born male, she might have been celebrated. Instead, she was criminalized for the crime of existing too prominently. She did what generations of Roman women had been told not to do. She refused to fade. And her fate would be mirrored by another Roman empress, less famous, but equally feared. Her name was Julia Mamaea, and like Agrippina, she was accused of ruling through her son. But worse than that, she was accused of raising him to listen. Julia Mamaea, Roman Empress. In the vast, brutal ledger of Roman imperial history, Julia Mamaea occupies a strange, flickering line between reverence and revulsion. She was no seductress, no lavish party thrower, no dealer in poisons or silk-cloaked betrayals. Instead, her crime, if it can be called that, was far more subtle and far more dangerous. She educated a Roman emperor. She influenced his policies. She protected him from the wolves of the Senate. She made herself visible, and for that, history tried to erase her with a familiar label: manipulative, meddling, and morally suspect. Born into the Severan dynasty sometime in the late 2nd century CE, Julia Mamaea was niece to the formidable Julia Domna and daughter of Julia Maesa, both women who had already proved the family's uncanny talent for ruling from the shadows. In a Rome reeling from civil war and imperial assassinations, the Severan women were political infrastructure. Where emperors came and went, they remained weaving alliances, guiding succession, and doing what no Roman statesman would admit: holding the empire together. Julia Mamaea's rise to prominence came through her son, Alexander Severus. When Emperor Elagabalus, her teenage cousin and predecessor, began to horrify even the famously unshockable Roman elite with his flamboyant behavior and religious upheaval, it was Julia Mamaea and her mother who orchestrated his removal. They installed her 3-year-old son as emperor, and with him, placed her hand on the wheel of state. From the beginning, she was not discreet about her role. Julia Mamaea sat beside her son during audiences. She advised him on legal reforms. She surrounded him with philosophers, jurists, and respected governors. She curated his education like a general plans a campaign. Where past empresses had pulled strings behind thick curtains, she simply stood in front of the puppet stage and spoke. This, of course, was intolerable. The Senate disliked her from the start, not because she was incompetent, but because she was competent out loud. They called her overbearing, accused her of undermining the emperor, of filling his head with impractical ideals and Greek philosophy instead of Roman discipline. When Alexander Severus resisted military expansion or declined to execute political enemies, it was Julia Mamaea who was blamed. Her influence, they said, was softening him, feminizing him, corrupting him. One historian went so far as to describe her as ruling under the guise of motherhood, as if the real offense wasn't her policy but her proximity. A mother with too much access, a woman with too much voice. The Roman imagination, always vivid and always suspicious, couldn't resist casting her as a shadow queen, whispering decisions into her son's ear, hiding ambition behind maternal concern. The idea that she might have loved her son and served the empire was apparently too complex. Instead, the stories defaulted to the familiar script. She was unnatural. A woman pretending to be a man, using her son as a ventriloquist dummy for her own unwholesome ambition. Julia Mamaea made a fatal mistake in assuming Rome could evolve. In 235 CE, during a campaign along the Germanic frontier, Alexander and his mother lost the support of the army. The emperor's reluctance to engage in full military retaliation, possibly guided by his mother's counsel, was seen as weakness. Soldiers mutinied, loyalty collapsed, and a rival commander, Maximinus Thrax, was proclaimed emperor by the troops. Julia Mamaea and her son were executed together in a mutiny so abrupt, so brutal, that it shocked even the chaos-hardened empire. There was no trial, no exile, no negotiation, just erasure. After their deaths, Julia Mamaea was cast as a manipulator whose soft hand had weakened the empire. Her son's policies were reinterpreted as naive. His gentleness, once praised as wisdom, was reframed as cowardice. And she, the mother who raised him to be thoughtful, temperate, and just, became a kind of political cautionary tale. What Rome refused to acknowledge is that Julia Mamaea may have been one of the last sane voices in an empire spiraling toward military dictatorship, but she spoke too clearly. She counseled too visibly. And like so many imperial women before her, she had the gall to believe that motherhood and statecraft weren't mutually exclusive. It wasn't her son who brought her down. It was a system that saw competence in a woman as corruption, influence as infection, love as weakness. And once that narrative takes hold, even motherhood is no longer sacred. Just ask Fausta, the next empress in this slow march of defamation, who was accused not of ruling through her son, but of trying to seduce her stepson. Because in the empire of rumor, queens don't need to sin. They only need to be seen. Fausta, Empress of Rome, wife of Constantine. Fausta's name doesn't echo through history the way her husband's does. Constantine the Great, the emperor who legalized Christianity and reshaped the Roman Empire, is remembered as a visionary, a founder, a near saint. Fausta, his empress, is remembered as a footnote, or worse, a scandal. Her story, when told at all, is usually reduced to one brutal accusation, that she tried to seduce her teenage stepson. But Fausta was more than a Roman cautionary tale. She was a political actor, a symbol of imperial alliance, and ultimately, the victim of a dynasty that used women as leverage and discarded them when they became inconvenient. Born around 289 CE, Fausta was the daughter of Emperor Maximian, one of the key players in the fractured tetrarchy that had split the empire into shards. Her marriage to Constantine wasn't about love. It was about consolidation, politics, power. At the time, Constantine was still a rising force, not yet the sole ruler of the empire. Marrying Fausta gave him credibility, a direct connection to one of the most powerful military families in Rome. It was a strategic alliance, sealed with a wedding band and sharpened with swords. Fausta bore Constantine several children, most notably 3 sons, who would later become emperors themselves. She was given the title of Augusta, a ceremonial acknowledgement of her role as empress, but also a hint at her influence. She wasn't just a figurehead. Fausta travelled with the court, appeared on imperial coinage, and was publicly celebrated during Constantine's early victories. Her name was linked to prosperity. Her image, elegant, solemn, imperial, was used to reflect dynastic continuity. But as Constantine's power grew, so did the internal fractures in his family. One of the more sensitive points was his firstborn son, Crispus, a child from a previous relationship, likely born before Fausta entered the picture. Crispus had been raised by Constantine as a legitimate heir, groomed for command, and given important military responsibilities. By all accounts, he was charismatic, capable, and increasingly popular with the army and the public alike. Which is, of course, where the problem begins. In 326 CE, without warning, Crispus was arrested and executed on Constantine's orders. No trial, no explanation, no defense. He had been a rising star suddenly extinguished. The rumors began almost immediately, and the version that took hold was this: Fausta, jealous of her stepson's prominence and eager to promote her own children, had accused Crispus of inappropriate behavior, perhaps even of attempting to seduce her. Or, depending on who told the story, she had tried to seduce him. There was no consensus, only speculation. Some claimed she was the victim of an unwanted advance. Others painted her as the aggressor. Some even suggested it was a mutual entanglement, a forbidden affair discovered too late. Regardless of which version circulated, the result was the same. Crispus was dead, his memory condemned, his name erased from public monuments and inscriptions. And then, in a final twist of imperial cruelty, Fausta herself was executed. The details of her death are notoriously murky, though one version claims she was locked in an overheated bath and left to die. Why? Again, no official reason was given. Historians, writing decades later, could only speculate. Some claimed Constantine had discovered the truth, that Fausta had lied about Crispus. Others said he learned of her alleged advances only after his son's death and punished her in turn. Still others believed her execution was a political cleanup job, the removal of a problematic empress after she had outlived her usefulness. What's clear is this: Fausta went from imperial icon to imperial embarrassment in less than a year. She was erased from coins, her statues taken down, her memory condemned quite literally in a formal act of damnatio memoriae, Rome's most severe form of posthumous erasure. And yet, despite the state's attempt to wipe her away, the mystery of Fausta lingered. Did she falsely accuse Crispus to protect her own son's claim to power? Did she fall victim to palace intrigue and jealousy from courtiers who saw her as too influential? Was she guilty of anything beyond existing too prominently in a dynasty known for self-destruction? We'll never know. What we do know is that her fall followed a familiar pattern. A woman at the heart of power, removed without explanation, blamed for the sins of men too powerful to be questioned. It's no coincidence that the charge pinned to Fausta, the blurred line between affection, influence, and forbidden desire, mirrors the same script used against other royal women across centuries. A queen's authority is never allowed to be just political. It must be personal, emotional, unstable. And if she threatens the throne by being too competent or too connected, then she's not just dangerous, she's perverse. But Fausta's story, like the empire she served, didn't end with her. Because the next ruler on our path wasn't destroyed by scandal, she was built from it. A medieval noblewoman, soldier, patron, and power broker whose sexuality and ambition were twisted into legend. Her name was Matilda of Tuscany, and she didn't whisper behind kings. She ordered them. Matilda of Tuscany. Matilda of Tuscany was not a queen by title, but she ruled like one. In a century dominated by men in armor and bishops in gold, she carved out power with intellect, faith, and to her later enemies, an increasingly suspicious independence. She became a military commander, a patron of the church, and one of the most influential women in medieval Europe. Which is precisely why, centuries later, she would be accused of everything from unnatural lust to backroom rituals, because in the medieval mind, a woman who held power must have had something to hide. Born in 1046 into the powerful house of Canossa, Matilda was a rare figure from the start. A woman raised not only to pray and obey, but to lead. Her father, Boniface III, Duke of Tuscany, controlled vast territories across northern and central Italy. Her mother, Beatrice of Lorraine, was equally formidable, connected to imperial bloodlines, and shrewd enough to govern as regent after Boniface's death. Matilda watched them both and learned not how to obey, but how to survive. By the time she was a teenager, Matilda had become heiress to one of the most strategically vital regions in Europe. She could control trade routes, military passageways, and the fortunes of popes and emperors alike. She used that leverage with astounding precision. Most notably, she became a staunch supporter of Pope Gregory VII during the investiture controversy, a bitter power struggle between the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor over who had the right to appoint church officials. It's here that her legend truly takes shape. In 1077, when Emperor Henry IV came begging for papal forgiveness at Canossa standing barefoot in the snow, according to the story, it was Matilda's castle he came to, her fortress, her mediation. She wasn't just present, she was central, and that moment romanticized as the triumph of spiritual authority over imperial arrogance also made her an enduring symbol of the church's political muscle, which, naturally, made her dangerous. Throughout her life, Matilda commanded armies, negotiated peace deals, funded monasteries, and corresponded with theologians. She remained unmarried for much of her life, and when she did wed, it was brief, strategic, and reportedly unconsummated. She had no children, no heirs, no visible romantic attachments, and for some that was simply unacceptable. Rumours grew in the vacuum. Chroniclers began to whisper about her manly behaviour, her military dress, her authoritative speech, her disdain for courtly flirtations. Some called her unnatural. Others implied more. In later centuries, Protestant writers accused her of intimate ties with Pope Gregory VII, not merely political, but physical. Still others, groping for a category to fit her in, portrayed her as a half-mystic, half-dominatrix, a holy warrior whose chastity masked secret perversions. But there was no evidence of scandal. What there was, however, was a long life of uninterrupted power, and that alone invited slander. The truth about Matilda is probably simpler and, in some ways, far more radical for her time. She was a woman who ruled without needing permission. She was celibate by choice, not by tragedy. She loved books more than banquets, and policy more than pageantry. And when she died in 1115, she left behind not a scandal, but a stable region and a church that owed her more than it would ever publicly admit. So why did later generations feel the need to sexualize her story? Because power without submission needed explanation. And the easiest explanation, always, is deviance. But if Matilda ruled like a man, the next woman on our path ruled like something altogether different, a wolf in queen's clothing, as they said. Her enemies accused her of betrayal, of conspiracy, of keeping lovers while her husband wore the crown. She was Isabella of France, and England would never forget her name. Isabella of France, she-wolf of France. The English called her she-wolf. Not because she tore throats out with her teeth, but because she did something worse. She disobeyed. Isabella of France, Queen Consort of Edward II, was never supposed to be anything more than a decorative link between two royal bloodlines. Daughter of Philip IV of France, wife to an English king, mother of a future one, her job was to smile, produce heirs, and keep quiet. Instead, she orchestrated a rebellion. Born around 1295, Isabella was married to Edward II of England at the age of 12. It was a typical dynastic alliance, cementing peace between two frequently hostile kingdoms. But the marriage itself was troubled from the start. Edward showed little interest in Isabella, and even less in running the kingdom. Instead, his affections and political attention were lavished on his male favourites, first Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser the Younger. Both relationships were controversial, not merely because they disrupted court politics, but because they displaced the Queen. Isabella wasn't just ignored, she was sidelined, insulted, and at times publicly humiliated. Land and titles that should have been hers by right were diverted to Despenser. Her household was reduced. Her dignity eroded. But Isabella watched and waited. In 1325, sent to France on a diplomatic mission, she made her move. She refused to return to England. She denounced Despenser's influence. And, in an extraordinary act of political rebellion, she allied herself with Roger Mortimer, a nobleman exiled by Edward, and one of the few men in Europe willing to help her take the crown by force. Was Mortimer her lover? Most likely. Their bond was political, strategic, and intimate. But in the eyes of her enemies, it was confirmation of what they always suspected, that Isabella was not merely disobedient, but deviant. A queen who abandoned her king and took up with a man not her husband? Scandalous, perverse, unnatural. When Isabella and Mortimer landed in England in 1326 with a modest invasion force, they were met not with resistance, but applause. Edward's rule had collapsed. Within weeks, the king was captured. Despenser was executed. Edward was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, the teenage Edward III. For a brief, remarkable period, Isabella ruled England as regent. But power has a short shelf life when worn by a woman. Soon, the same nobility that had cheered her rebellion began to question her legitimacy. Mortimer's influence grew too visible. Isabella's past too controversial. In 1330, young Edward III asserted himself. Mortimer was arrested and executed. Isabella was imprisoned, not harshly, but permanently sidelined. She spent the rest of her life in semi-retirement, living in relative comfort, but always shadowed by the image of betrayal. The legend of the she-wolf was sealed. Was she ruthless? Yes. Was she calculating? Undeniably. But her greatest crime was not rebellion, it was being effective. She did what countless male nobles had done before her, removed a bad ruler. But she did it while wearing a crown and a veil. And so, her revolution had to be rewritten as a scandal, Her strategy reframed as seduction. Isabella of France didn't just break the rules, she rewrote them in blood and exile. And the fact that she survived, that she died in bed, not on a pyre, only made the story more unsettling. But if Isabella was branded a traitor, the next empress on our path was branded something worse. A wife who didn't wait, a widow who didn't mourn. They said she took lovers while her husband was in exile. They said she didn't just betray a man, she betrayed an emperor. Her name was Marie-Louise of Austria. Marie-Louise of Austria, Empress of France. When Marie-Louise of Austria was married off to Napoleon Bonaparte in 1810, the political optics were carefully arranged. A Habsburg Archduchess, the daughter of the Austrian Emperor, becoming the wife of a man who had once humiliated her father in battle. It was not a love story. It was an imperial insurance policy, a marriage meant to temper Napoleon's ambitions, to legitimize his reign with old royal blood, and to bind the restless empire of France to Europe's oldest monarchy. Marie-Louise was 19. Napoleon was 40. She didn't protest. She didn't have the right to. The public relations campaign framed her as the new Marie Antoinette, but improved. More modest, more pious, more obedient. She was everything the last Austrian-born French queen had not been. And for a while, it seemed to work. Marie-Louise gave birth to Napoleon's long-awaited heir, the King of Rome. She appeared beside him at official events, followed protocol perfectly, and made no political waves. But in the shadows of that immaculate image, a different narrative began to form. And once Napoleon's star began to fall, Marie-Louise's reputation fell with it, just not in the way anyone expected. When the tides of war turned against France, and Napoleon was forced into exile on Elba in 1814, Marie-Louise did not follow. Instead, she accepted the role of Duchess of Parma, a small northern Italian territory granted to her by the victors of the Congress of Vienna. It was a compromise, a gilded retirement plan, offered to keep her quiet and out of the way. But rather than playing the part of the grieving exile's wife, Marie-Louise accepted the duchy, and the freedom that came with it. That freedom came in the form of Count Adam Albert von Neuperg, an Austrian general, a widower, and, according to scandal-hungry diplomats, the man who quickly became her advisor, companion, and lover. The timing was problematic. Neuperg had been dispatched as part of her escort to Italy. His official role was to guide and protect the Duchess. Unofficially, rumors swirled that he had been sent by the Austrian court to ensure Marie-Louise never returned to Napoleon, never rejoined him in his final chapters of ambition, and never became a political threat to the carefully reassembled European order. That she took him into her confidence and eventually into her home confirmed everything the rumor mill needed. The woman who had been a symbol of dynastic obedience was suddenly painted as disloyal, self-indulgent, and morally questionable. Napoleon, in his bitter isolation, reportedly referred to Neuperg as the one-eyed sneak, and viewed his wife's abandonment as a personal and political betrayal. The public took this narrative and ran with it. Pamphlets mocked her as a fallen empress. Cartoons depicted her in compromising positions with Neuperg. The idea of a woman moving on, especially when her husband was not yet dead, was treated as scandalous, almost unnatural. The fact that Marie-Louise had been placed in an impossible position, caught between a defeated husband, an imperial family desperate to control her, and a world that had no use for her grief, was ignored. She lived with Neuperg openly in Parma. They had 3 children together before marrying, quietly, after Napoleon's death in 1821. By then, she had already been erased from France's romantic memory of the empire. Napoleon was reimagined as a tragic hero. Marie-Louise was reimagined as the woman who didn't wait. But what else could she have done? She had no real power to save him. No army, no influence, no political capital in a Europe that had already decided Napoleon was a menace to be locked away. And yet, she was expected to sacrifice herself at the altar of his memory, to mourn forever, to live as a symbol of imperial loyalty rather than a human being with a life beyond the battlefield. Her crime, if it was one, was not disloyalty. It was independence. She accepted her new role, created a quiet court in Parma, and governed with a steadiness that surprised many. She embraced a love that was not dictated by empire, and in doing so, she violated the unwritten rule that powerful women, especially those tied to fallen men, must remain statues of sorrow. Marie-Louise of Austria never declared her innocence, because she never accepted the premise of her guilt. But the next woman would find herself scrutinized in whispers, not for what she did in exile, but for how she behaved within the boundaries of courtly expectation. She was a writer, a patron, a devout Catholic, and, according to her detractors, a queen with more private liberty than public restraint. Her name was Marguerite of Navarre, and they said she dared to enjoy herself. Queen Marguerite of Navarre. Marguerite of Navarre was, by any standard, ahead of her time. A 16th century intellectual in a silk-lined cage, she played many roles: queen, playwright, philosopher, diplomat, and religious reformer. She was sister to a king, Francis I of France, and wielded enormous influence in a court saturated with politics, poetry, and peril. Her mind was formidable, her pen sharper than most swords, and her reputation? Forever entangled in the question of how a woman so brilliant could also be so unguarded. She was born Marguerite de Valois in 1492, into a world just beginning to flirt with the Renaissance. While other royal daughters were taught needlework and hymns, Marguerite devoured theology, languages, and classical texts. By her teens, she could debate philosophers and write verses in Latin. She married Henry II of Navarre in a union that elevated her to queen, but even before the crown, she was already commanding attention. Her court in Navarre became a haven for thinkers, writers, and reformers, particularly those aligned with the more moderate wing of the Protestant Reformation. This alone made her suspect. The Catholic Church viewed her patronage as dangerous. To shelter dissidents was to signal sympathy, and to be a woman doing so, scandalous. But it wasn't just her religious leanings that caused unease. It was the way she moved through her world freely, curiously, unrepentantly human. Marguerite wrote the Heptameron, a collection of short stories inspired by Boccaccio's Decameron, which explored themes of love, virtue, betrayal, and human weakness. The stories, while not obscene, were frank daring in their treatment of desire, and surprisingly sympathetic to female autonomy. The book was praised, banned, edited, and quietly passed around courts where women blushed while reading, and then read it again. This, of course, gave her critics the ammunition they craved. How could a queen, a woman of faith, of high standing, write such things, discuss such themes, portray women not as saints or sinners, but as complex creatures with minds and desires? The line between literary imagination and moral judgment blurred, as it often does when a woman writes too well about things men would prefer to control. She was accused, not openly but insidiously, of scandalous looseness. Some claimed she sympathized too closely with her fictional heroines. Others suggested she had lovers among the poets and courtiers who surrounded her. There was no evidence, there rarely is, but her refusal to act scandalized gave way to the assumption that she must be scandalous. Marguerite's writings spoke often of love divine, romantic, tragic, and that, too, was used against her. If a woman writes about passion, surely she must be ruled by it. If she defends those persecuted for religious dissent, surely she harbors forbidden beliefs herself. And if she enjoys the company of clever men, surely she must be guilty of something more than conversation. What her enemies couldn't stand was that Marguerite refused to be reduced. She could write about lust without being lewd. She could entertain reformers without renouncing her faith. She could express affection without obligation. She lived in the contradictions and thrived there. She died in 1549, respected but misunderstood. Her work would be posthumously edited, sanitized, and softened but never erased. Because some perversions are not about behavior, they're about refusal. The refusal to fit neatly into the categories prescribed by power. Marguerite of Navarre refused to apologize for her intelligence, her curiosity, or her joy. And for that, she was labeled with the same word as queens who conspired, betrayed, and killed. Perverse. Which raises the question, in a history written by men, where desire is a weapon and silence is the expectation, what exactly makes a queen perverse? Perhaps it's simple. She existed, and she did not ask permission.